Spacefarer. Welcome to WTUFO. I hope you're enjoying watching or listening. If you'd like to support the show directly, you can do that at patreon.com/WTUFO, patreon.com/WTUFO. That will help increase the chances that the show continues to exist. If you're listening on a podcast player, you can also rate and review us. That'll help the algorithm know to tell other people about us. And likewise, if you're on YouTube, you can like and subscribe. And finally, if you're really digging it, you can post us on your favorite social or put us in a thread to your friends. Just kind of helping us spread the word, since we're a new show, is extremely useful and a valuable contribution to our mission. So thank you so much for engaging. I hope you enjoy the episode. What the UFO? I'm here with Nick Gold, the founder of Declassify UAP. Hi, Nick. Great to meet you.
Thanks for having me, Caleb. You have a lot of terrific guests on this show, and it's a real honor to be one of them. Hopefully I can match up.
That's extremely kind of you to say. For anyone who hasn't encountered Nick's work, he is personally one of my favorite voices and minds in this conversation. Nick, you have a way of being extremely clear, very serious, dry in a fun way, and sort of preternaturally equanimous, calm, cool, just collected. And I really appreciate it. I aspire to be as chill and sharp as you are. So thank you for your great work so far.
I'm glad I have you fooled.
Okay, well, would you mind if we spoke just a little bit about your career to start? Did I understand correctly?
I mean, hey, take it as far back as you want to. I can probably relate it to UFOs somehow.
I've heard you say you came up through politics. Is that accurate?
Well, let me describe my professional career. Went to school for communication and media studies here in Baltimore. I went to a small liberal arts school called Goucher, and stayed in the Baltimore area. I moved down from Massachusetts when I was, 18, 19.
Massachusetts.
Yeah. I'm a masshole. And,
nice.
I'll be in Maryland for probably the rest of my life, but I'll always be a masshole at heart.
Okay. Me too. I'm outside of Boston in Marblehead right now.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah, I love it. I have lots of family up there. But I came down to the Baltimore area, went to school, majored in communication and media studies. Kind of a funny thing. I did a minor in political science, which was actually probably a lot more difficult, just given the teachers and the coursework and everything, than my major. I had been under the impression a minor was required. I was wrong. I found out that like halfway into my senior year, when I was basically done with all the requirements, that I actually didn't need to have done a minor. And I'm really glad that I was wrong and did the poli-sci minor, because it was a really interesting entree into the realm of politics that obviously you're a little close to when you're in Baltimore. DC is very accessible. Had a very influential political science professor who did a lot of work around Latin America and kind of was involved in revealing Iran-Contra in the 80s. And learned a lot about Latin America, but also kind of the regimes that rose in Latin America and the US's influence on that. And just a very important moment. She knew at the time the deputy press secretary who was under the Clinton administration, and took one of her classes that I was in to a White House press briefing. And so we're in there. That was when the press secretary was, I think it was Mike McConnell. It's a very small room, that White House press briefing room. And so we were just like crammed into the back, probably about 10 or 12 of us, students and the teacher. And then we got to meet with the deputy press secretary afterwards. We met with a very well-known Washington journalist, Tom Hamburger, who she's friends with. And it just instilled in me in this young age, this sense that DC and the goings on, even at the very highest level, not even just in the United States, but kind of planetary power, is accessible. Like, it's a real place. You can actually go there, and it's flesh and blood, human beings doing their jobs, doing their thing. And it's not far removed. And I'm very thankful I had that experience and did the poli-sci minor, because I wouldn't have had that experience and been instilled with that had I not. Also was very into technology, even computer music. I've always been into techno and electronic dance music and all that fun stuff. Baltimore was a little bit of a draw for that, because it used to have a really, really cool scene back in the 90s. So, I had that exposure. But most of my career quickly stayed kind of in that technology meets media track. Had a few jobs after college, including working for the Apple Care support organization, right as Apple was sort of blossoming into what they've kind of become. People thought they were dead for years, and then jobs came back, and he started launching things like the iMac, and wireless Wi-Fi was kind of coming out, and the iPods and OS 10, and I was like on the front lines of Apple support organization as those kind of new technologies were happening. Literally had a day where I heard a voice in my head, like Apple shares were like under $10, and I was like totally poor, a few years out of college, and there was like a voice. It was like, put everything you have into Apple now. And I was like, even like, tell your friends, tell your family. And I didn't have any money, and I didn't listen to that voice. If I had, it would have been a several 100-to-1 return. So, I missed that. I missed Bitcoin, all of these things, not my destiny, I suppose. But, stayed kind of in that technology realm, especially in the media space. Got a job with what's called a systems integrator. Systems integration can mean many types of things with various technologies and bringing them together to create a solution. Lockheed and Northrop Grumman and those types of firms are technically kind of systems integrators because they build the systems of systems. But I was in this IT space that was really focused around information technology catering to the media industry with a real focus on video. Some of that surrounded Apple's technologies, and this was as Final Cut Pro was kind of becoming more respected. But we were doing things like high performance shared storage systems for video editorial environments, archive systems, these whole software platforms that do what are called media asset management and workflow automation. It's really like how you handle all of your media data and all associated ancillary data from really the moment of capture all the way out to distribution and archive. A lot of it involves the management, not just of the data and storing it and tracking it and allowing people to collaborate around it and do what they need to do, but also metadata. This is a term that I think a lot of people have learned over the last decade or two. It's the data about your data. So in the world of media, metadata can be really not only just all the technical stuff relating to your media data, but also all of the descriptors, the kind of qualitative descriptors that relate to your media. What's in the video? What's in the photo? So we built and designed and implemented these media asset management and storage and archive and distribution and transcoding, et cetera, systems for every type of organization you could possibly imagine. And we dealt with major media companies. I worked with some of the top movie studios, top news organizations, broadcasters, sports teams and leagues, corporations who have obviously kind of corporate and enterprise media departments for a variety of reasons. But being in Baltimore and being so close to the DC circuit, a lot of our work, it wasn't even the majority, but it still represented a pretty good chunk of my time, was working with all the stuff that surrounds DC. So that meant some very interesting federal agencies, including a lot that come up in UFO conversations. I want to make really clear, none of my work directly related to that. But it was a very interesting opportunity to be very firsthand in walking through those buildings, working with those types of customers. I really enjoyed it a lot. And that was kind of funny because in college, I was the guy who was like ranting about the NSA's Project Echelon. And, I've remained, concerned about, what they might refer to as like turnkey totalitarianism, including in this current environment. But it gave me a very humanizing feel for those types of organizations. So it was federal agencies, some of the big defense contractors, largely working with some of those types of customers in the federal space. I worked with one of these clients who was a tier one, special operations type organization. That was really fun. And, again, doing the same kind of things I was doing in the corporate and media realms: data storage, archive, media management, distribution, workflow automation, metadata management, all of it. But everyone does that. So I was also working with political action committees, super PACs, lobbying organizations, think tanks, nonprofits, everything that surrounds DC to kind of influence, how decisions are made and how money is spent and what policies are arrived at. And, it was funny that I had that political science background, because while I wasn't like in politics per se, it continued to just sort of reinforce this trajectory where everything in that realm that I, in college, even not too many years previous, seemed so far out and at a remove. But then it was like, I'm walking through these corridors. I ended up having a security clearance at one point. I could like walk in the front door of places that even a few years before, I just wouldn't have expected that they would let me walk in the front door. So, it was a really interesting set of experiences. My clientele ranged every side of the political spectrum, every side of the ideological spectrum, major names that have shaped the course, frankly, of America, that, some of these orgs that people know and, might have very strong feelings about, I was working with even before, like, they were kind of on people's radar. So it was just a very, really cool set of experiences to take my passions around technology, around rich media and video and communications. Again, that was kind of my school background, but then also be involved in so many different types of major and even small mom and pop organizations, but everything all over the map. And, some of it took me out to Los Angeles with a major movie studio and the archive there that I worked with. I was up in New York a lot. I actually had a kind of a part-time apartment in New York and Park Slope, Brooklyn, which was super cool. And I would take the Amtrak back and forth between Baltimore and New York regularly and spend about a week and a half up in New York doing business and having a lot of fun and going to parties and dancing and, other things. And then back to Baltimore, where our home office was. So just a really, really interesting career path. Again, I'm not going to claim to understand some of these issues that I'm here to chat with you about today from having had those direct experiences. It didn't touch that issue. In fact, I didn't have a need to know anything. Having the clearance was really a matter of access to facilities, making it easier for me as more of a technical, but business development and kind of system architecture kind of guy. Mm-hmm. Even walk in and out, not needing to have an escort to go to the bathroom, which is like a thing you have to have if you have a red badge, or a V on the red badge with a visitor badge. So it made kind of accessing and just doing work in that realm much easier because we were a small company. I mean, we were like 25, 30 people working with these, like the biggest organizations on the planet in some cases. So, if I ever needed to touch a keyboard in a certain facility and even type a few commands or even plug cables into something that had been attached to the house network, the clearance would have allowed me to do that if we needed to kind of scrape by and have me help out for a day in the more technical realm. So, but it never gave me need to know of even anything my clients were working on in that world. And I'm not like going to poke around. No, wasn't trying to pull a Snowden or anything. Not my cup of tea. Very kind of rule abiding, ironically, maybe when I was in that realm and, really respected the heck out of my opportunity to work with that set of customers. But I said it before, it really humanized it. Like, I know what it's like to hold a security clearance and go through that process and how it kind of affects you and affects the dynamics that you're balancing when you even like have access to things that most people don't have and how sensitive that can be. Just a funny anecdote. I was going to a client's facility once and we've gone through the little entry and there's the guard with the, M16 or whatever, AR-15 and drive around to the parking lot we're supposed to get to. And in the parking lot of this government customer's facility, let's just say there was on like a pedestal as sort of like a display, a formerly Black Project military aircraft that's very well known, that this agency was had helped devise and operate many, many years previous. And I was like, I can't believe they just have that in the parking lot. And that's wild. And you can actually see it on Google Maps. So like, it's just those little anecdotes, but then like, these are flesh and blood people. Like I found that most of the people in that realm are super, reasonable and patriotic. You do have some eccentric personalities, but it was just a set of experiences that oddly kind of infuses my perspective as I do this work with Declassify UAP, trying to gain government UAP transparency and kind of knowing at least what they look and feel like, this set of orgs and people that surround this topic that I've been passionate about since I was a very little kid.
Wow. So how long ago did you found Declassify UAP?
It was, let me think about this for a second. We're in 2025. So I finished up a contract working for a Spanish software company that does these media management platforms at the end of 2022.
Okay.
And, you know, I was getting a little burned out. Again, the business development world can take a little bit of a toll. It's exacting. You have things like numbers hanging over your head. And, you know, I'd been doing that for years at that point. And this was no longer with that small systems integrator here in Baltimore. I had moved around, had a couple of gigs. I actually left the SI in Baltimore to work for a DNA-based data storage and computing startup out of Boston.
Whoa.
Called Catalog DNA. And I met them.
Data in DNA?
Yes, use synthetically generated DNA molecules not only to capture digital information, but to potentially molecularly compute on the data that's stored in the form of DNA molecules that you have synthesized.
That's some future stuff right there.
If people are interested in that, they can look up on YouTube, Nick Gold, Catalog DNA. And I gave a couple of talks. One was at the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers annual conference, where I presented a paper I had put together on our technology. I wasn't part of devising the technology, but I had to find a way of communicating, because the company I was involved with was doing it in a stranger and more interesting and novel way than even other efforts that have tried to store information in DNA, which is something people have done for decades now in very limited forms. And the company built this giant printing device that actually used modified inkjet printer nozzles to deposit very small, fragments of DNA sequences that were synthetically generated. And you had to stitch them together to essentially represent what was really almost you could think of as a molecular IP address that each custom sequence you generated and stitched together and kind of enzymatically sewed together. Think of that molecule as being sort of a placeholder for one bit of information in an encoding set. And it has a unique sequence. And if the sequence is there, that slot in your encoding job represents a 1. And if the molecule isn't there, it represents a 0. Anyway, I had to find a way to even come up with that kind of an explanation for it. Because I was fairly technical and I was I just don't fully understand what we're even doing. And so it was fun to kind of use my communications background, present at SMPTE, present at, what was it? Maybe, I think it was USC or something. So weirdly, there's a Nick Goldman in the DNA data storage and computing world, who's a scientist and much more technical than me. So it's not the talks of Nick Goldman giving talks about DNA data storage. There's the ones that are Nick Gold, me giving some of these talks. They're a little more cursory, of course. But so I left the systems integrator to do that. I had a few other jobs. I then was working with the Spanish software company that I had known previously through my career through 2022 on a contract. And when that kind of wrapped up at the end of 2022, I was okay, I need to take a break. I've done all of this crazy systems integration with, all of these types of interesting customers. I have done DNA data storage and computing, and was involved in landing a few pilot project contracts. I had to help write these. I'm not a lawyer, by the way, but come to legal agreements with firms that were going to be testing the DNA data storage technology. And it was talk about just a weird contract to have to cut and meet everyone's needs when this is a totally novel thing. And keep that in the back of your mind, because that is informing my efforts today with UAP. But having to come to agreements that meet all stakeholder needs when you're pitching something so new and so novel that people haven't thought about really before, and then come to an actual legal agreement that everyone's lawyers and everyone can sign off on. It was a really fun opportunity. So, I had done that. I worked for the Spaniards, which was a blast. Got to go to Spain a couple times. I'd never been there.
Nice.
Loved it. Out in Malaga, they were based. And, this was a company called TDL, and really, really enjoyed the people there. It was awesome. But, I wanted to take a break after wrapping that up at the beginning of 2023. And I was what do I do? And, I had been following all of the UAP stuff because, again, I'm a UFO lifer. From 6 to 8 years old, hooked on this stuff in the 80s.
Okay.
And so I was like, following very closely this new set of developments that began, actually close to my birthday at the end of 2017. I'm end of December, and it was like a few days before my birthday. This New York Times story launches and a Politico story. And so I had been following that very closely. This was clearly like new kinds of things to occur, even in my lifetime relating to the UAP topic. There was never an above the fold article in the New York Times on secret UFO programs in the U.S. government, especially recent ones. So I had been like following closely, and kind of was thinking, I want to try to maybe do something around this interest and this passion, and frankly, a pretty deep knowledge base I have. I wouldn't say I'm like one of those UFO researchers like Richard Dolan or whatever, who has just this absolutely deep and broad encyclopedic knowledge of every case and every permutation. I wouldn't describe myself that way. However, I do know the topic very well. I'm kind of more of a generalist in how I think about things. I'm a fairly sharp generalist. And so being a generalist is really useful in UFOs because, as you know, it touches like every other topic we could possibly think about. If you really start, peeling back the layers. Yeah. And so I've always thought that kind of generalist attitude served me well as I was interested in the UAP topic and surrounding areas, which there are many. And so, I was like, I feel like I have something to add to this. But what do you do when you have that kind of a passion for a topic like this? And it is kind of starting to be taken more seriously by the mainstream, but it wasn't clear to me. But what informed me was all of those experiences working in my professional career, including those types of orgs in DC, both federal agencies and contractors and everything else, media companies, private sector firms, think tanks, nonprofits, PACs. And what struck me was that DC has big shining buildings, not just for every issue that people care about or every ideology, but like every point of view on that issue. There's like the big building with wonks trying to come up with policy to like practically hand out guns in schools. And then there's like no guns. And then every permutation in between, like they each have their own orgs and organizations and, staff and shiny building and, money coming in and out, and they're influencing policy and they're helping come up with legislation. Again, every issue has this from every point of view. But there was none of that for UFOs. I was involved with the Galileo project, so there were some scientific efforts. I then, after leaving Galileo, which was an interesting story, I was invited to join the SCU, the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies. So even though I'm not a trained scientist, I, again, as a fairly sharp generalist, I can think scientifically about the UAP topic. So there were like nonprofits, a few of them, but mostly focusing on kind of UFO science. There wasn't lobbying firms to do something around the topic that, there weren't think tanks. This was a little before Soul was really kind of kicking up and things like that. So I noticed this sort of void in the kind of orgs that you see for every other issue in DC and the DC area relating to the UAP topic and UAP transparency. So I knew that did I want to start a nonprofit or try to go in with people to start a nonprofit and lobby for this? It wasn't quite clear to me. And then it was about halfway into 2023. A good friend of mine, we were talking, and he said, you should just, this isn't the exact words, but he was like, you should do the Nick thing. Whether that's a YouTube channel or podcasting or whatever your thing is, like you have these interesting, interests, Nick, you're articulate about them. You have this passion and way of communicating, just give it a shot, go do your own thing. And for whatever reason, Caleb, like a switch flipped in my head. And I had the vision for Declassify UAP basically like pop into my mind's eye. And I was like, I do want to create an org. I don't need to worry about because with a 501c3 or even a C4 nonprofit or kind of public lobbying org like a 501c4, you need several people to start it. There needs to be a board. The corporate formulation is a little more complex, or frankly, a lot more complex. And when my friend said this to me, it was like I got this permission to just kind of take the DIY, do-it-yourself approach. And I was like, I can do this as an LLC. I can, maybe just lobby for reasonable UAP transparency and declassification. I can stand up a website. I can have that little form on the side on the action center that people can fill out a few fields and hit a button, and in 30 seconds have it send a message encouraging their own elected representatives, which is important because they really mostly care about their constituents. So, there are these platforms that if you have ever filled out a little thing on a website for an issue you care about and hit a button, it sends something to your elected officials. I wanted that. So I had to find the contractors and, have a little bidding war and, get a good price and, find which software solution. I had to find a web developer, which interestingly, I knew a guy who is actually one of the Reddit UFOs forum moderators. And he's also a web designer. He had done like Jacques Vallée's website and a few other cool websites. And he was totally on board and gave me a real good friends and family rate. And so like the pieces just started coming together somewhat easily once that switch had been flipped. And, I decided it was actually the day of the July hearing in 2023, which I managed to get into because I took the first commuter train down from Baltimore to DC. I was in front of the building like 10 minutes after 5 a.m.
Nice.
A little line forming. So I got in, people can see me, especially in the shots of Dave Fravor testifying. I'm in the background like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm here witnessing this right now.
Yeah, that's huge, man.
I have this silly kind of shit-eating grin on my face, through most of it, which people are familiar with if they've seen that photo of mine that I use in social media. So, I think it was literally that day. It might have even been in the room. I submitted the little form because I had familiarized myself with what do you have to do to become a registered federal lobbyist. I wanted to cross every T. I wanted to dot every I. I wanted the LLC. I wanted to be legally covered. I wanted to do it the right way. I wanted it to be something that, could be built upon and be taken seriously and conformed to how other issues who have orgs that do this kind of thing are formulated. I wanted it to just be of that type. So it was funny, that was obviously an historic event, which was pretty amazing to witness. But within a couple of days, I got outreach from Politico. They were it was their lobbying beat reporter who I guess, there's public accessible systems, computers that say, oh, these people registered as lobbyists this week. And they're between the hearing and then seeing Declassify UAP pop up on that list that they monitor regularly. They were like, oh, this might be a good story. So Politico made me and Declassify UAP and that effort the focus of their piece that day.
Nice.
Which was really cool. I got to be on News Nation a couple times because they saw that and were like, oh, this guy can speak to some of the nuance of these issues and kind of the politicization of the topic. And so things just really, kind of happened, and Declassify UAP came together. I was able to quickly coordinate and find, I'd already even kind of been motivated by some of the real grassroots activities that I was seeing take shape on Reddit forums and things like that. A fellow that I've worked with and become good friends with, Ronak Patel, he's now with UAP Caucus, which is Lester Nare's organization. People might know Lester, just again, one of the best minds in this space, as well as Ronak. And Ronak had been writing kind of form letters and posting them on Reddit and using them, offering them as examples that people could adapt and use to send messages to their own reps. So that was actually setting off light bulbs in my head that this grassroots side of this issue was starting to formulate. And that's, again, helped motivate me to have that vision of what I imagine Declassify UAP being. And I've been able to, do a lot of collaboration with him and with Lester, UAP Caucus, and some other orgs as well. So, been doing it, kind of scraping by, not doing them every other message that I'm sending out asking for donations, because I just found in my heart, it was hard for me to just try to so squarely make the monetization of the UAP issue just such a drumbeat of what you have to communicate about if you're kind of trying to sustain yourself. So luckily I've been in the position where I didn't super have to worry about a paycheck for a little while. And I was able to just concentrate on the org and getting the message out there and encouraging people to be involved with campaigns to reach out to their elected officials about the UAP Disclosure Act, some of the hearings that have occurred, people's feedback in the general public to those events, and just really starting to communicate specifics to their elected officials. And what we've seen is that this is now an issue that's taken very seriously at the highest levels of government, the leader of the Senate, or now the Democratic, minority leader. But Schumer, working in a bipartisan fashion with Rounds, who is a very significant and level-headed Republican senator.
I've heard you say you like his vibe a lot.
Yeah, and it's like that spirit of cooperation around something, because the topic itself is serious and deserves attention and deserves transparency. That's been really refreshing. Not every politician, and this is especially on the House side, makes it as bipartisan. Some have kind of adapted UAP, I think, to their kind of partisan way of looking at things and their ideological way of looking at things. But not everyone has done that. And the issue is now kind of, embraced, frankly, by a lot of Democrats and Republicans. And, I'd like to think, my only goal for Declassify UAP, Caleb, is like, if I can even help be one piece of nudging this issue forward as something people actually take seriously as just a political issue, and we're going to respond to it like we respond to other political issues that we care about, and we're going to have mechanisms, and we're going to write our reps. But we've seen like 4 or 5 years of serious legislation get passed on the UAP topic. Everyone knows what a UAP is, especially in the corridors of power in Washington. Members of the intelligence community and DOD speak to it. We had Lloyd Austin speak to it a month or two ago. I mean, all of these strings of directors of national intelligence, John Brennan, former head of CIA, saying they might represent another life form. Like,
something which some people could potentially consider to be some form of something that some people might call life.
It's crazy. And yeah, he was like all squirmy, Brennan, when he was saying that on that podcast.
It's a tortured quote.
Not a guy you see squirm a lot or searching for words a lot. So the fact that it's risen to that level, I love that, with elbows linked with a hell of a lot of people, including thousands and thousands of members of the public. I mean, Declassify UAP, between 4,000 and 5,000 individual Americans have sent, I think it's like about 28,000 individual messages to their representatives in Washington, including the president. And, we're all here elbow in elbow virtually, but also in person, because there's been some in-person events, and getting huge crowds for these hearings is a big thing. It gets a lot of eyeballs on the topic in DC when suddenly there's lines around a corridor for a UAP hearing in a congressional building. So just feeling like I've been one of many that are elbow in elbow and trying to get the government to move forward on this and take the conversation to where it's at today is just a wonderful feeling. We haven't kind of gotten to the end zone, so to speak. This might shock people, but I really think we're like on the 5-yard line at this point. I think on many levels we're closer, and in fact, elements of disclosure have already occurred.
So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the momentum that you see happening right now and the state of play. To timestamp it, we're talking at the end of January 2025.
I think it is. Seems like such a blur. Is it January? Is it 2025? Well, I mean, I'll say this. Even that New York Times article in 2017, because, people have to understand what something like that represents, because that's an institution, the New York Times. And maybe it's a little bruised at this point in some people's opinions. I would tend to agree with that. But still, a very significant global organization that in many ways represents kind of establishment thinking and what the serious people in the world take seriously. And so, like, even for that Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, Helene Cooper story to have hit, and it's kind of the mirror story that took place in Politico on the same day, that represented itself an element of disclosure. The fact that such a serious organization will take the topic seriously and then report these are individuals, these are some organizations they were associated with. Initially, here's a couple of Navy videos. A third one came out some months later. Here's some, conversations with those naval pilots describing things like this Tic Tac thing or this stuff off the East Coast in 2015 timeframe. Like, I never expected to see that story on the front page of the New York Times. So that's kind of a piece of the puzzle. What has since occurred is a string of government reports and a string of government hearings that, from even currently sitting officials, acknowledge that things that look and behave like the thing that you have in your "What Must We Believe" poster behind you, they're real. Like, they've said it now. They're real. People see these things, including very serious, highly trained people operating, several $100 million fighter planes and, Princeton, radar, ships and all of this stuff. They're really seeing these things. They look and behave like what you think of when you think of UFO, not in a generic, some unidentified thing in the sky, but like, okay, picture what a UFO looks like. They're saying, like, they're putting out little pie charts of shape categories, and they look like the same shape categories that people have been reporting since the 40s. So that confirmation alone is very significant. And again, represents a concrete piece of disclosure. Because think about it. The thing that we're now talking about is what they are, or what the government might know them to be, or suspect them to be, and how that might relate to the public's experiences around this topic, because it's not just military people seeing this stuff. The public see this stuff all the time. Like, it's amazing to think that that's what the conversation is now about.
As opposed to whether they exist.
You're not willing to say they're ET, or there's no verifiable ET, but you're not going to say it's not NHI, and you're still keeping the door open on all these things. Like, that's where we are. If anything, I almost feel like we're halfway into the process now. So there's a lot to feel good about. Still some real work to be done.
Yeah, I think people picture disclosure as presidential address. We're not alone. There's a non-human intelligence, something like that. But I think you've done a good job of describing this spectrum of disclosure events that can include everything from statements from CIA directors to pie charts with shapes of objects. And I've heard you mention recently that the new director of Aero, Kozlowski, I think, has been more forthright in saying, everything's on the table here, basically.
Very much so. I mean,
what we think.
If people just see a couple quotes from him, they're not getting the full picture. They need to read every interview the guy did with the media when he went on a little bit of a media tour a few months ago, when he was kind of taking the new position and going a little more public. They need to look at the media roundtable. It's on the DoD's website. You can look at the transcript from that he did with members of the media. And then you need to look at every word he said in Senator Gillibrand's Senate hearing, which occurred, about a week or two after the House hearing at the end of last year in November. I was able to get to both hearings. I didn't make it into the House one this time. I was in the overflow room, but I wish there had been more members of the public at the Senate hearing. There was maybe like 10 or 12 of us, and there was room for probably 50 or 100. So there should be more of a showing, even when people are not like, oh, this is going to be a bunch of whistleblowers saying stuff. This is going to be like more boring government people, not even asking really the right questions. Well, that still needs people to show up and be present.
Yeah.
But all of the words he said, even with Sue Goff, the kind of, frankly, PSYOP officer that's assigned to this issue at DoD right now, God bless her, she's doing her job.
Sure.
I don't necessarily agree that it's the right job to be doing, but I'm sure she's a patriot and all of that. But even with her kind of in the corner of the screen, hovering behind Kozlowski acknowledged full on. He described, they didn't release media. They seem to imply that media might exist, but there was at least several events that he described that were like, some dude saw a real UFO looking thing and it did some real UFO type thing. And he's saying these are real events and they don't understand what they're dealing with here. And the physics defies us. So, and that's been echoed by many people now. So I think there's a reason to be optimistic. He spoke to the fact that they have brought in declassification experts. He spoke to the fact that they're looking at stuff they have that's been captured by very sensitive platforms that they cannot talk about for very legitimate national security reasons. And that's true in many cases. And trying to deal with, how do you put more material evidence in front of the public when you can't even acknowledge the thing that took that image or that sensor data exists, right? It doesn't officially exist in the public realm. It's a classified platform, some classified satellite, some classified underwater monitoring system that we look for Soviet nuclear subs and stuff. How do you put that forth? So one of the things I tried to do with Declassify UAP, just to sidestep for a moment, is I created these declassification targets. It's one of the main sections on Declassify UAP, because I wanted the effort to almost be as much for the insiders as it was for the public to engage. I also wanted to define for the system, the establishment, what the public is looking for that could probably be reasonably delivered. And so I even talked about things like summaries of what the sensor systems are picking up. Even if you're not giving us the deets, Just one example people might remember. Remember that little submarine that was, I think it was called the Titan, that was investigating the Titanic and sadly had a major structural issue and imploded essentially.
Yeah.
Navy intelligence acknowledged like a week or two later that their underwater monitoring systems actually did detect that implosion event.
Yeah.
That's a system that they do not like talking about. They do not like talking about the stuff underwater. And on one level, it's almost more secret than the stuff in space. So clearly, that was one of several examples that I'm aware of where they're at least comfortable saying this thing happened. Our system that we can't really talk about verified some characteristics. We're going to summarize that in a real high level way, but we are going to put out there and kind of declassify that our system picked that up because I'm sure that was classified and someone made the decision, let's declassify the fact that we actually heard that submersible implode.
Notably, just to hop in, they didn't do that for months, I believe.
There was certainly a delay. And
and that created a time during which the world was focused on thinking these people might be alive and looking for them.
There was all sorts of stuff. And think about where we're at now. I mean, we're at least 80 years into the contemporary UAP thing. We have to imagine there's decades and decades of such sensor data, including generated on platforms that no longer are even deployed, that like probably are releasable at the very least in some summarized form. And, so talk about how many decades we've been waiting for even some basic summaries. Like, I'll give an example. It would be really cool if they said, okay, the public is well aware of this Tic Tac incident. Former director of ONI, Scott Bray, he was deputy director, but he was running the org at the time, when he was at the 2022 House UAP hearing, acknowledged that the Tic Tac incident happened as people understand it. And he said, we have data on it. Can you give us a little summary, an official summary on government letterhead that said, we did see it descend from maybe roughly this altitude to sea level. We saw it move from the rough location that Commander Fravor and others witnessed this thing. And then it went to this cap point, this kind of rally point for the jets. Can you summarize how quickly you think the object accelerated and moved? All we need is a little summary that starts to validate that like actual serious sensor systems are picking these things up. And indeed, they have data and reason to believe that what was described by Fravor, at that hearing with me in the background being like, I can't believe I'm seeing this in person right now, actually happened. And that's what the sensors picked up on. So there's all of these mechanisms to do that in a way that I think can be safely delivered to the global public. Because once you give it to Americans, you're giving it to everyone, including our enemies. So, or adversaries, or all of that. And so they have to be very sensitive. Anything that you or me learns from the U.S. government, there's foreign intelligence agencies who monitor all the news feeds, and they're going to know it the second we do. So they have real legitimate reasons to be quiet about this stuff. I still think the ultimate thing, well, there's a few things holding it back. Ultimately, we'll get into that. So there are other nuances, but again, I wanted to create a picture of how some information really could be released and done in a way that preserves national security interests, because I take that really seriously.
I also liked your point about taking stakeholder interest seriously. I heard you allude to this earlier in the conversation, and I've heard you discuss it elsewhere. Would you like to go into that a little bit?
I would. In fact, I'm almost going to say it's sort of the drum I'm beating right now. I started to think about this, frankly, for a couple of years now, and certainly throughout the life of Declassify UAP. We kind of officially launched publicly on September 1st. Ross Coulthart actually tweeted it out. I had given him and some others some early access to the site, and he was a little enthusiastic and fired off a tweet. And I was like, I guess we got to go live now. Ross Coulthart tweeted about it.
He scooped you.
It was great. It was awesome. It couldn't have worked out better. And thank you, Ross. When the UAPDA came out, I was obviously very excited about it. For your listeners, if they're not aware, this is the UAP Disclosure Act that in its original incarnation 2 years ago really was in fact, it was announced about a month after I started working on the Declassify UAP website. So I'm in the middle of trying to stand up this thing, and suddenly there's this like UAP legislation on a silver platter coming from the leader of the Senate. And I'm like, oh, cool, we have a bill that we can include in our message that people are going to be sending to their reps. How convenient.
Yes.
Like, it couldn't have happened any better. And so, and other people like also took advantage of that. UAP caucus, they had already been kind of stood up, but then that bill came into existence. So the timing was just almost kind of strange and worked out really well. And very supportive of that bill, its aspirations, the language in it, what it speaks to, super serious. Again, even the bill itself, coming from who it came from and with the support of who is supporting it, is a part of disclosure. The bill clearly says, and this is coming from the Senate, which passed the bill, not the whole Congress, but the Senate passed it. And it says, this is real. And, NHI is part of this, and, anomalous technology is part of this, or I think they call it technology of unknown origin, and they define all of these things legally. They talk about this international disclosure process that needs to occur with us from the highest levels of government coordinating with other governments around the planet. I mean, it's amazing. But I did start to think about it, especially when only one element ended passing. The piece that passed is an important one. It was the creation of this UAP records collection at the National Archives, which just started to put together some records. And I think it's September 30th of this year, they put out archives to all the federal agencies. You're supposed to give us all of your UAP records by September 30th, 2025. Like the classified stuff, the unclassified stuff. Not everything is going to go to the public website, but the part of the law that was passed from the UAPDA is every federal UAP record is supposed to come to archives. And then we have this kind of placeholder website for the stuff that's going to get reviewed and declassified or is already unclassified. So that's important and that's great. And everyone should be keeping their eyes on that and keeping an eye on that website and looking for more information to start to appear, hopefully over the course of this year when agencies, in a trickling fashion, probably hand stuff over. That's all well and good. But let's go back to my career. I had to do business with every type of organization under the sun, every side of every spectrum. And this, at certain points, included federal agencies of the type that sometimes come up in these UFO conversations, some of the big contractors that are involved with those types of organizations. And again, just the politics of major news organizations or broadcasters or movie studios. In every one of those environments, you have groups of different interests. You have different stakeholders who need to come together to kind of execute a project. You've got, in my world, it was the video users and the editors and the producers and the graphics people, but then very quickly you get pulled into like the facilities people and the IT teams, which are usually not deeply integrated with the media teams, even though the media teams use information technology for everything these days. IT is often a different group. Then you've got the budgeting people. If it's a government agency, you might have a contractor who already owns essentially a prime contract to deliver certain types of services and goods into that organization. And so you need to kind of work through the prime contractor and potentially be a subcontractor. All of these different groups that need to sit around over a table, come to an agreement about what they're going to stand up, equipment and technology, and again, project-wise. Who are all the stakeholders? How are they all going to have to be involved? How can we get everyone on board, everyone, and make it fit a budget that meets everyone's need? And people really feel that when you, as the contractor, working with this group of key stakeholders, when we all walk away and say, okay, we can cut the ribbon on this, it's done, everyone feels good about it. Everyone feels like they've won. Everyone feels like they can go back to their bosses and say, look at this thing I was part of that ended up being good for everyone, including us, and it worked really smoothly, and we maintain our power and our influence within this organization, but the video guys got what they want, and it fit the budget needs, and management likes it, and there's an executive, kind of stakeholder who signed on to the project, and they're happy. It's like, everybody happy. I don't remember that Family Guy episode. It's like, everybody happy. And I started to realize, again, even going back a year or two, maybe not quite two, but close. If you look at the UAP Disclosure Act, I ask you, is it that kind of a contract? If you think of that bill as a deal that needs to be cut, and you think about who all the stakeholders in this UFO topic might be or likely are, does that deal look like the deal that all of the stakeholders are going to walk away from the table feeling good about? I mean, think about it, right? First of all, what's the bill based on? The bill is based on the JFK Records Act, which created the JFK Records collection on the National Archives website and led to lots of good information about the JFK assassination coming out. People say, oh, we haven't gotten every last thing. We've gotten a lot. Like, we've learned a lot. We learned a lot about how closely the CIA was monitoring Oswald. Very possible, at least, that part of the cover-up and why those records took so long to release was because of embarrassment. Like, they probably should have busted the guy. Now, that's one possibility of several. That's probably the more likely one on the surface based on what we've learned. So we actually have learned a lot from that. But think about the bill in that circumstance for JFK. First of all, it's oriented around, like, what? One of the crimes of the 20th century? The assassination of a president, like a uniquely traumatizing experience in the history of the United States, frankly, and especially in the lifetime of people living today and our parents and grandparents. It called for an investigation. A crime has been committed. A wrong needs to at least partially be righted through these actions and through digging through records and exposing wrongdoing and whatever it might be. We need to investigate this, and maybe some heads are going to roll. That's what infuses a bill like the JFK Records Act, because that was the situation that gave birth to it. If you're a UFO stakeholder, like a real one, like we've been dealing with these things, maybe we've got them in sub-basement B47 or whatever, right? Like, who knows? I don't claim to know for sure what the scenario is, but let's say
you're talking about like an intelligence agency or a defense contractor.
Exactly. Like, do you feel great about walking away from that deal if you're kind of all framed as being the bad guys who need to be investigated?
Yeah, no.
Like a crime has been committed.
Yeah.
We need to reassert eminent domain. Like, now granted, I believe that the federal government has inherent eminent domain over any freaking thing that crashes out of our sky, whether it's a Chinese spy blimp, whether it's a freaking UFO. Like, there's no question legally. The entire framework of our government is that the state is the sovereign. That's what we fought for in the revolution. It's not going to be a person who's the sovereign. It's not going to be a bloodline who's the sovereign. And it's not that there's no sovereign. People get very mistaken and they think like the US was founded on this notion that there should be no government or no sovereign. It's not true. The whole idea was that this body of the state is the sovereign at the end of the day. And so, yes, of course, any freaking alien spaceship or whatever, or time machine, or who knows, interdimensional device that appears or lands or crashes, of course the sovereign is going to have sovereignty over and eminent domain over that. But do you want to have it rubbed in your face? Like, do you need the 3 underlines? And I remind people of this. Some of these documents came out in the last year or so, the Kona Blue documents. They're actually on the arrow.mil website. Kona Blue was what was going to sort of take up the work of OSAP BASS that had been a DIA project. When that was kind of winding down after a couple of years of funding, they were trying to pitch it as a program and even potentially an SAP to the Department of Homeland Security to take over that work. And the pitch deck, essentially, which had been a classified document with code words assigned to it, Kona Blue, which was a classified code word, came out and was released. And so we basically have the ability to look at what was pitched by the crew that had been involved with OSAP to DHS. And there's a couple of little mentions of MOUs, memos of understanding, that might have been what kind of legally allowed certain recovered things to move from the government's possession to a private contractor's possession. Because they were under the impression they might be able to get a hold of this stuff and bring it into their kind of more normal secret program than not so normal secret programs. And it refers to these MOUs. And think about that from the contractor standpoint. In this hypothetical scenario where a contractor was in an agreement with the federal government and took possession of some highly anomalous stuff, biologics, technology, who knows, right? Could be whatever. I'm thinking, if I'm them, I thought we already had an agreement, guys.
Yeah.
What happened to that agreement? Like, because, I think about this, Caleb, again, putting in like media IT systems for government customers. It's not the same as dealing with recovered UFOs, and I'm not trying to paint it as being the same, right? However, here's what I can tell you about doing that kind of contract work. In my own experiences, it's like you're always bending over backwards for the government customer. They are the ones who have the dollars, and you're doing what you can to like get them happy enough to do the deal. And, like they make unreasonable requests. They do things that are like such a pain. They're not necessarily helping your profitability. Like it's all this stuff, and you're just kind of bending over backwards. And that's how a lot of that stuff works. Not, some of these big contractors, they make good money off of that. We made money, but like, frankly, it was a thinner margin working with those customers than it was with private sector customers and just like kind of media customers or sports teams or whatever. You have to go thin. There's sometimes open bidding, sometimes not in an IC type environment, but still like the contractor is often at the whim of the government customer. So I'm just hypothesizing here, but I'm like, let's say this whole system has developed over decades and decades to kind of deal with this UFO issue in a not so normal way that we deal with things. Maybe the Gang of Eight in Congress is not being read in properly. Maybe there are some games being played to divert funds from one program ostensibly to some other set of needs that are kind of nestled up against it or even completely separated. Like whatever. They're playing games to get the funding in place, possibly. I don't know that, but maybe there's some games being played. My mind goes to like, it was probably a government policy coming from the top of the executive branch that led to the contractors being told, this is how we're going to do it. I don't think a Lockheed or a Northrop or a Raytheon or whoever was like, oh, by the way, Uncle Sam, we want to play all of these games to do this. We want to classify this topic. We don't want to tell the public anything about this. Like, to me, that just sounds like a government policy, policy that was made many years ago, that is being maintained, and that like a lot of people probably kind of bent over backwards to accommodate. So going back to the UAPDA, and suddenly this whole new group of government characters is interested in this topic all of a sudden, relatively. And they're like, oh, we just want to wipe the board clean. This is the new agreement. Forget all that stuff over the past 75, 80 years. It's like, if I'm one of those stakeholders, I'm kind of like, screw you, buddy. So when I see that like the bill and some of the significant elements of it, which are important from a transparency standpoint, seem like they get held up in a few key leadership offices when the National Defense Authorization Act bill gets negotiated in committee at the end of the year, and it's all behind closed doors, and there's a few key individuals in the leadership roles who can kind of put a kibosh on it.
Who happen, like Mike Turner, to receive disproportionate amounts of their campaign funding from defense contractors. Let's just say
there is a chance that some of those decisions are being influenced by a variety of stakeholders that have pressure points and they know where to exert that pressure.
Yes.
So, like, it's no wonder it's getting held up if you think of them as a stakeholder, love it or hate it, love or hate the scenario, love or hate how it's been dealt with.
Yeah.
It's like, serenity now, forget that. This is what the situation is. These people are stakeholders. Could we find a different way of doing this that meets everybody, including the public's need, but also including the intelligence community and the DoD and the defense contractor base and the politicians who are looking for political capital always, for a variety of reasons. What if we were to just start from scratch and say, what is the model for cutting a UAP declassification and transparency deal in the form of a bill that we can get all of these folks in agreement on? Let's start there. What might it look like? And that's a conversation that I am really trying to hasten, instigate, be part of, put out there, seed the idea, and hopefully people will talk about it. And I'll just say quickly, there's been all of this stuff with, the Skywatcher team and the supposed, recovery team that Jacob Barber was part of, and this other military and technology guy, Dr. John Blitch, kind of came out and has kind of been backing them and supporting them and talking about his own experiences. Blitch was talking in one of his Ross Coulthart interview, which was, I'm sorry, I think it might have been the Matt Ford interview, and maybe he said it on the Coulthart interview as well. Like, he's ready to forgive, but it kind of, I don't remember if he used these exact words, but it needs to happen around more of like a truth and reconciliation framework.
Yeah.
The public deserves at least some safe level of the truth so society can move on and start to adapt around this reality and do the research and do the studies and just incorporate it into our overall paradigm and ontology. And he is even willing to forgive some potentially very nasty stuff that could have occurred at a few points. But the truth needs to go hand in hand with that. But I'm like, there's no reason inherently we can't make some of the existing stakeholders walk away from this, making them feel that they might even be more winners, bigger winners, if we go in this new direction.
Yes, I totally agree. I think this is such a brilliant line of questioning and good idea and like just structural innovation to the whole conversation. The idea of getting these stakeholders not just to grudgingly accept something like this, but actively push for it so that they're calling their committee guys and going, actually, we want you to push this. Not we want you to kill it.
Exactly. Instead of putting the finger on one side of the scale, they put the finger on the other side of the scale. And, I don't know if it's my personal philosophy as a non-dualist that I see things this way, where I'm not looking at things as bifurcated or this versus that. I mean, sometimes we have to kind of embrace those dichotomies in life, but this is not an issue that strikes me like that. This is, to me, I use the analog, and you've probably seen me use it before, of germs and the discovery of microorganisms. And which took like hundreds of years, the discovery that we actually interact with these things, because that was rejected for ages after we had confirmed the existence of microorganisms. They cut open bodies. They said, how could these things be involved with disease? They're inside of us. They can't be involved with these diseases. That's got to be the miasma, this invisible cloud of stuff that contaminates us, or our humors and our bodily fluids are not in the right balances. So we need to bleed you. We need to like squeeze out your phlegm. We need to do this. We need to do that. Like that was literally how people thought diseases occurred. And we already knew about microorganisms. They had already been discovered. And there was this rejection of like bringing these realities together. I'm reading this great book called The Discovery of the Germ, and anyone who's interested in UAP transparency should read it. Should read it. The Discovery of the Germ, because it feels like the best analog we have to this new realm being sort of discovered, but then us kind of sitting on it and then kind of using our imagination and thinking about like what it's up to and how it works. And it just taking really not even so much like discovery per se, but a willingness to acknowledge that like there is a relationship between this invisible realm that's everywhere and ourselves. And we got through it, and like we only thrived. It's not like we've mastered microorganisms. Like we just had a major pandemic. I don't feel like we're totally in control of these invisible things. I've got them all over my body. As we're talking, I'm breathing them in with every breath. We know that this microbiome thing is literally like sending thoughts and signals and emotions into our brain. Like there's this crazy feedback loop that's taking place. You eat a lot of corn syrup and you create the wrong kind of colony in your gut that then starts feeding wrong messages up into your head, and you don't feel so good, but it gives you cravings to give that colony more of what it wants. Like we haven't mastered this at all. We've only been talking about the microbiome for like 15 years or whatever now. So, and we're playing around. We're like, maybe we can transplant people's crap into one another and cause like health problems. And we're finding that there's something there.
It can actually help. Yeah.
So like, we don't have that realm mastered at all, but we finally broke through that barrier of denial that this is not only real and we kind of know it's there, which is sort of where we're at with UFOs now, but like it's part of this greater ecosystem that we all share. Whatever the ecosystem is, if UFOs are real, it's broader and more diverse than we thought. It involves a whole other tier potentially, where we've just been thinking in terms of microorganisms and us. We called ourselves the macroorganisms because we thought we were the big ones. I'm like, what if there's meta-organisms above the macroorganisms? And now it's more like a three-tiered structure, and we're all interreacting in various ways. So
that's a great analogy.
My model. And when you think about it that way, it's like, there were some winners and losers when it came to drug discovery and the fact that like microorganisms are a thing that can sometimes give us disease. Science and medicine and soap and all of these like things became more popular. And the kind of more fairy tale and imaginary way of thinking of like this invisible miasma or your bodily fluids being out of whack or whatever faded away.
Mhm.
And I like to think that that's probably more similar to what a fuller acknowledgement of the UAP situation might resemble. I don't know for sure, but it might resemble that, in that it will change things. And there will be some orgs that are oriented around certain ways of thinking and doing that can accommodate that reality. And frankly, it might have more to offer in that new reality. And some might wean in their popularity. I like to think that the things that might deflate in popularity are probably the things that aren't serving us very well, much like imaginary thinking about what disease was all about didn't really help us. And it was kind of a good thing that that set of beliefs and practices faded away and the modern medical system emerged. So I think we all can absolutely be winners on this topic. And that includes these, characters, both federal agencies and contractors that are almost always cast as villains in these scenarios. And it's like, I've worked with some of these folks. I'm sure there's some villains when we learn about some projects and programs that probably weren't quite kosher and copacetic, but like all in all, it's usually very patriotic people. They're smart. They probably could have gotten higher paying jobs in the private sector, but they care about what they're doing. And they generally can work together, even if they have some really interesting personalities in the mix, because they know that they're trying to do something that's bigger than them. And that even includes the big contractors. So I just don't see why this can't be like the discovery of the germ and our relationship with microorganisms, which is both for positive and negative. We couldn't survive without microorganisms. Like we evolved with them. If there weren't fungi breaking down things, we'd literally have just piles of dead stuff building up. So, I take that ecosystems-based approach, and maybe what these UAP indicate is that, again, it's maybe broader and more stranger and maybe just more amazing than we thought. And we have to figure out like how that extra stratum works with the other ones, because it's all probably one big system. And the better we know it, I think the more effectively we can work with it.
That's such a brilliant frame. And I want to move to the science next, but I want to linger on stakeholder incentivizing just a little bit to close this section off. One thing that comes to mind is incentivizing contractors by acknowledging these memoranda, sort of baking in some of the deals that pre-exist our current awareness of the situation. Another that comes to mind maybe for intelligence agencies is certainly the Truth and Reconciliation, some kind of like defense umbrella that says, okay, maybe shady stuff happened. We're not marching everybody to Guantanamo. We're going to figure this out in an orderly fashion. One other that popped up for me is the possibility that these programs, which are operating currently under like deep secret classification, might be able to recruit more brilliant young scientists who are currently not available to these programs because they're smoking pot at MIT or whatever. So maybe you could get stakeholders on board in that way. Are there any other ideas that you have had about like how to incentivize various stakeholders in here? Like you mentioned, politicians wanting to look good. Do you have any ideas?
You just rattled through a few of the obvious ones really articulately and fully in many ways. Like, let's look at the contracts. Let's make sure at least the Gang of Eight and maybe some others in Congress on the right committees get read into what those legacy contracts look like. And let's see, is there a way of grandfathering them? Like, I imagine like the firms that probably have been involved with this, they're probably not exclusively the firms that you would want dealing with this. You would want to open that up. And again, think about the big defense contractors. They work with smaller suppliers for everything else. Again, they're systems integrators. Talk about the thing you really can't do when it's so secret. You can't integrate. You can't see that there's a small little startup that you want to start working with as a bigger guy and maybe even fund and maybe even invest in and do some partnerships because they've got this cool new technology and you know that it would apply to this other thing. But like, it's just too secret to work with those guys. So you have to keep it in sub-basement B47, right? Like, the whole economic realm, and this is why I don't shy away from things like VCs potentially being involved. I don't want it to be those VCs that have psychopath eyes, and I think a lot of us know who they are, because you can frickin' see it on their faces and look at their actions and their sig hails and all of the other stuff and say, okay, maybe I don't want those guys to be the ones, but I've worked with VCs. I worked for a DNA data storage startup. It's like, They're not horrible people universally. The fact that we have an economy, that money is a thing, which is really just a form of energy and information like everything else. It can be used for good or for ill. Like, look at how much the world has changed through information technology, communications technology, through venture-funded startup activities. We've completely changed the planet. So thinking that those systems can be part of another world-changing thing is not so alien. They do that. They're actually well-equipped to innovate around very new things that are kind of like harder for major entrenched government agencies or whatever to really, kind of innovate around. Like, the guys have a lot of nimbleness. They can experiment. VCs invest in things that they don't necessarily know are going to work out. They spread their money around and they say, one of these guys might pop and it's going to make me all my money back and more. But I'm going to kind of be willing to invest in some experimentation because we need to get a bunch of chefs in the kitchen until we figure out like who's the best chef. So, and I see that as leading to many potential economic possibilities. Think about it. Northrop Grumman builds the new B-21 bomber and has built the B-2 and builds all sorts of other stuff and ships and this and that because the big defense space is very consolidated at this point. There's 3 big guys and maybe 8 or 10 other little guys, and they all work together anyway. It's super consolidated. So Grumman is one of these big firms, Northrop. They also build the James Webb Space Telescope. Like you couldn't have deployed that thing. And by the way, I'm in Baltimore. The Space Telescope Science Institute is like 10 minutes behind me by foot. It's on my regular walk.
Cool.
It used to be one of my clients back in the day. I worked with their media and public outreach office many years ago. And that was just when Hubble was a thing. And it was really cool because I worked with the guy. If you've ever seen that Hubble deep field image, where it actually is animated and you go through and it's cool. All of those things you're seeing are galaxies. Those aren't stars.
Yeah.
And they kind of stitch together many deep Hubble images.
My mic is kind of blocking it, but I have the James Webb version of the deep field in my room.
So it was like the predecessor to that Hubble took. It's like I got to work with one of the team members who helped assemble that edit that took you through the deep field shot from Hubble. And they were like, oh, you think this is cool? Wait till James Webb happens. Because, it was still like 15 years out. They tried to cancel it a bunch of times, finally got stood up, somehow miraculously successfully deployed. That's Northrop Grumman. I mean, and the Space Telescope Science Institute and NASA and a bunch of people working together to figure out the nature of our reality. Like, I walk by their building. I literally give them a little blessing almost every time I walk by, if I remember. In fact, I'll just say there's a little hiking path behind the building and you can get really close to it. And it's like, sometimes I lay my hand on it. And I'm just like, I hope you guys keep figuring out really cool stuff because they have. Like they've figured stuff out with James Webb that they don't know how to explain at this point.
Yeah, like galaxies
that are way more massive for their age than like our current models understand and things like that. And I love it. And maybe something like that could even pick up a techno signature in a separate star system or something. Yeah. So I love that. And, having again been a very little part of working with them in the past. And I'm like, if Northrop Grumman and the federal government and all of these scientists and, Hopkins, which it's on the edge of, because there's the Hopkins Astronomy and Astrophysics Department literally across the street from them, not directly affiliated, but a lot of expertise goes in those directions, crosses the street, literally. I sometimes see them when I'm taking my walks, walking across. And I'm like, we could do that for this topic. And yes, like nuclear technology, like nuclear weapons, nuclear power, we probably have to be very secretive about some aspects of it, very protective. It doesn't mean you don't have people studying it and getting brought into those realms and becoming nuclear engineers and working on either the, for better or for maybe, more destructive forms of harnessing those technologies. But like, we do that. And I don't see why theoretically, a hypothetical Northrop or a Lockheed or a Raytheon couldn't also be working towards those types of more open projects around this discovery. Because I think of this as a discovery. I'm like, the story is pretty basic. By the middle of the 20th century, it seems like a major discovery had been made, and the decision was made not to share it with people. And it was going to be studied in secret, and it kind of just kept getting buried. And again, the policy decision was made, and they figured out how to play the games around it. I don't think it's this giant program. I don't think like the whatever, how many trillions of dollars that they can't account for when they audit the DoD. I don't think that's going to the UFO program.
Mm.
I think a lot of it is just they don't know where, like, how that piece of paper lines up with that thing that they have. I mean, some of it is just like auditing issues. It doesn't necessarily mean money is getting stolen. There could be malfeasance, and that needs to be looked at. But like, there's just, every little bone in my body says, if anything, this has probably been underfunded because of the level of secrecy involved.
Yeah.
Some of these insiders have said the cost of the secrecy itself and maintaining the secrecy is more of a budget line item in these programs than the actual research work.
Right.
And as you said, you can't recruit people.
Yeah.
You can't even say it's a thing to recruit around.
Right.
So, like, if they're having to pick and choose who they can bring into this program, it's a limited subset. You don't have kids in school from an early age saying, I want to be a scientist who studies whatever those things are or might be. So we need to develop that. So why not make those big guys economic winners? Why make their lives easier by acknowledging this?
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in forgiveness, Caleb. And I think for this UFO topic, we may have to make the decision between a willingness to forgive and then move on. Again, that truth and reconciliation part. But because we're able to do that as a society, get the disclosure that we're looking for in a much more concrete fashion. And I think those things might have to go hand in hand. Like, forgiveness is a really useful thing in this world. If we can move beyond, and I say, look at Rwanda as just one of countless examples through human history. People were like having their family members' heads and limbs hacked off by their neighbors. If they can move as a country to a truth and reconciliation model when that level of stuff went down, I'm sorry. Like, even if there was a few murders over the years and some awful cover-ups and some laws being maybe a little violated, especially from the legislative branch's perspective, maybe some things with money. I'm sorry, we can move on from that. Like, let's move into the new world where we can take this on and then reap all of the benefits that, like when we acknowledged these germ things, and by the way, they seem to be affecting us in some ways, and sometimes for good, sometimes not so good. If we get to that point, the potential payoff, I think, is so much greater, and there's so much more win for everyone to share in. We need to make that the focus and not this kind of vindictive attitude where heads need to roll and we need to, like, I think that should all be identified. That's the truth part. We deserve at least some level of truth. But forgiveness and moving through it and coming up with a model that works for all the stakeholders, I think, is what's going to get us maybe someday to that fireside chat in the White House and the president and some former presidents and the intelligence community, but the head of NASA and the National Science Foundation, do a joint presentation, and they tell the world, at least as they best understand what's going on. But most of disclosure, I think, will have already occurred by the time something so formal happens.
I think you're right. It'll be a broad base that leads us to a pointed moment like that. Just a gut check on this. It seems to me like the economic incentives probably want to be in the driver's seat. The truth and reconciliation seems like it might calm nerves at some of the intelligence agencies, for example, but I'm not sure it would be enough to incentivize them to take the deal, at least until they feel like this is going to happen anyway, and they just need to take whatever's on the table. But giving just like a second clause to the eminent domain sentence, for example, that's now starts like the American government owns any such craft. Clause 2 could be, and will agree to license this technology to, various contractors who apply, and will give precedence to those with historic memoranda, something like that. Like,
there's a lot of ways it could be handled, including simply, let's make sure the right members of Congress, both the Gang of Eight and the right committee members, are read in on what those potential MOUs were. And heck, like, is there really a big problem if we say, and by the way, we're going to just grandfather those agreements totally for 25 years, for 50 years?
Yeah. I like that idea. A big chunk of time, but not infinitely necessarily.
there's no limit to what can be written into the law as long as it follows the law. And these days, apparently we're all very flexible on what that means.
Yeah.
So it's like, make it work for everyone. I actually get the indication over the last handful of years when we see these, Chris Mellons and Grushes and Favors and now the Jake Barbers and the all of these folks, all of them. To me, that represents the tip of the iceberg. We're not seeing under the waterline. And what the tip that we've seen indicates to me is that there's probably a ton of people in these organizations who are ready for this change.
Yeah.
We're not seeing all of them. We're seeing probably a small sliver of the ones who are like really ballsy, pardon the term, and want to come forth. But I am sure they are backed by many more. Even when Avril Haines, who was the current, most recent DNI under Biden, when she spoke at the National Cathedral, she's an interesting character. She does not have the typical resume for someone ostensibly running the intelligence community. I think an open-minded individual is how most people would describe Avril Haines. And, she's willing to sit there at the National Cathedral and have an open conversation that touches on this stuff and say, she said, we're trying to figure out if it might be extraterrestrial. She said that point blank.
That's great.
It should have been on the cover of a newspaper somewhere. It wasn't. But, to me, that signals that even at a very high leadership level, there is an impetus and an interest in changing. Like, I'll give you just another example. He's spoken before on it, and he said some very stark statements several years ago. I think it was maybe CNN. James Clapper, who was another one of our directors of national intelligence. Again, top official in the intelligence community. Position that was created after 9/11 to kind of be the one sitting on top of these 18 plus agencies of the IC and try to, be both checking things and coordinating and everything. Clapper said a few years ago, he kind of takes responsibility for part of the cover-up of the UAP topic. He said this point blank in an interview on a news program. It looks like he's going to be appearing in this upcoming documentary that I think we're a couple months away from. It's going to be premiering at
South by.
Yeah. And it seems like he's going to be saying some more on it. Clapper is an institutionalist. He ran, I think, the NSA. He was the DNI. These are like really senior establishment people in these organizations. If they are signaling so concretely that they are willing to talk about this and even say things like, I take responsibility for the probably not quite right lack of transparency around this, it tells me that actually these institutions are really ready for the change. They just need to be offered the path that meets all of the stakeholder needs. And again, it's why I think we need to focus on thinking through legislation moving forward. And legislation is just one part of it, but at least have that stuff be a little more informed by this kind of communitarian approach where we're not looking at villains and wrongdoers. Again, there needs to be some acknowledgments. Maybe there needs to be a few heads that roll ceremonially, or at least some kind of, eating crow or whatever, some egg on the face. But let's just try to figure out how all these people can win and the public wins. And we move to possibly a very new era that we might get to live through. I want to live through that. And I'm willing to forgive and move through things to come up with whatever that new permutation is.
So let's look at that for a second. I've heard you say elsewhere that you would take a long vacation on the beach if we could just get to a point where people engaged with this as an interesting scientific phenomenon on a broad scale. And this is kind of my feeling as well. I just want us to open the floodgates and get everybody interested in it. We don't need to have an answer on when the Big Bang happened or what's causing cosmic radiation, but we're aware that they're interesting questions and we're broadly moving toward an answer. And when we get to that point on UAP, I feel like the hardest part is done. And then there's a very interesting multi-decade, multi-generational conversation to follow, unpacking all the details and maybe interacting with some of these beings or whatever. But so the core question for me has become, how do we get to this point as soon as possible? And one question I want to ask you about that is, How has scientific funding and the question of national grants for that floated up for you? Have you thought about incorporating requests to elected representatives to support, say, like National Science Foundation funds into your disclosure project?
I have.
All
Now,
right.
So, I mean, I know that's a very pithy answer. So, I've been doing a lot of thinking about that. It's informed some of my conversations that I've had and some of my messaging, absolutely. And even talking with people at SCU about these topics, and trying to start to game out what that might look like, because I honestly think UAP is a topic through orgs like NSF and NASA. It's like 100 million plus per year thing in its early phases. Like if you're starting to build observation systems, you are bringing in scientists, you're creating grant programs just to fund the humans who need to do the work, much less build potentially expensive equipment.
Right.
This needs to be like, what is that, 9 figures? Like, well into 9 figures. I mean, pilot programs are going to be very nascent. Maybe work with some folks who have already started up some of those types of efforts. Then also some of the big guys who probably could contribute, who maybe have been, but only in more closed capacities, because they might have a ton of capabilities that they can bring to bear that they've been developing for 75 years. Who knows? So, I think that funding is key. And, it's a little bit of a useful aspect if there continues to be, and it's a big if, but if there continues to be pushback in kind of the transparency legislation specifically, and declassifying and focusing on the DoD and the intelligence community and the big defense contractors, a way to at least partially and possibly circumvent that. And in some ways, Skywatcher is a little representative of this, but more from a private venture-backed way. But it's like, just do the work and get the work funded, because if that discovery starts to come in, then you're ahead of it. And then the government just has to kind of like keep up with what's being revealed through these other activities and research efforts.
Yes.
But it needs to be a lot of money. And as you said, that's why lobbying will need to continue to occur with our government officials, so they slot in science funding for these efforts. I'm less hopeful in the current environment about asking the government to spend more money, because if anyone is paying attention to what's happening in politics right now, that is not the trend line we're on when it comes to anything. I mean, we had a major plane accident in DC last night, a very unfortunate incident. Literally the day before, they were trying to get like everyone who possible to quit the FAA, including air traffic controllers. Like they're trying to scrap the US federal government right now. And that's not compatible with saying we need to spend 100 or 250 million a year on this new UAP thing.
Yeah, although I would point out that according to Robert Powell's calculations, at least 1 to 2% is like, 100, 200 million a year. That's like 1 to 2% of the National Science Foundation budget as it currently exists. Yeah,
it's nothing. It's a rounding error. However, that's the logical scientific way of looking at it, as Robert is prone to. And I love Robert. I get along with him really well. He's really appreciate his knowledge base and his perspective. But he is looking at it like an engineer, or even a manager from when he was managing the aspects of the silicon industry at AMD and stuff like that. Looking at it like a business decision. He's looking at it like kind of just a logical framework. The problem is any spend in the current environment is a political decision. And the politics will, no pun intended, will trump the logic of setting aside a relatively small amount of the budget, because the politics and the emotion behind them dictates that not only do we not want to spend more on anything, we're in a mode of trying to scrap the federal government. So the politics, alas, in the current environment, especially in the executive branch, don't probably support such initiatives. Doesn't mean you don't still try to move forward with those initiatives. Maybe there's a path there, but it's a lot more challenging when the entire core of the message is scrap, scrap, scrap. It's unfortunate. And it's why, realistically, as much as people hate it and as much as we would love to see this be government-driven and nonprofit and all of that, we may have to look for private funding sources, because if like the government is getting scrapped before our very eyes,
we're back to venture bros
left with money.
Yeah. Patagonia vests, as one of my friends described it, coming to save us. That's a good point. Have you considered at least adding a sentence or two into your form letters about supporting funding from the NSF? Or I know at the moment your letters are pretty focused on transparency. Is that right? Have you incorporated some language, or have you looked at?
I haven't yet, but it's been. I mean, you're saying things that I've absolutely had front of mind. I haven't, given the current environment, which is a week into a new administration.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think because of the chaos, less eyes are going to be on the UAP topic now that in government, especially in the executive branch, than previously. I know people felt like Biden was a big blocker. I don't necessarily have the same read, because things in politics happen kind of on the public level. And then there's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes, and those often are not clearly in alignment with one another. So a lot of progress happened in the Biden administration, under the Biden administration when he was in office. Some of that was obviously led by the legislative branch. But Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden have known each other for decades and worked with each other for decades. So to think that there was no cooperation going on there behind the scenes. Again, people pick people and say, oh, that guy's the villain. That guy was the blocker. The fact is, we just don't really know that for sure. There's a lot of rumor, Jake Sullivan. It's like,
okay,
for all we know, Jake Sullivan was, running, just interference to try to get that UAPDA passed. We just don't really know based on a few rumors and what was said publicly. So unfortunately, the chaos is so strong now with every other topic under the sun, including very pressing things like ending $2 trillion in government grant programs, and then the next day rescinding that order. And I'm sorry, folks, but the black and white of it is, whatever your political stripes, this is not an environment that's now conducive to taking on much bigger, broader issues that are sort of net new. We're really down in the weeds of the basics at this point, how much of the federal government even is going to exist in 4 more years. So I think there's a challenge with, the funding argument. So I'm in this interzone, frankly, right now, Caleb, where I'm how does one message around this topic, given where the climate is at? Do you push, just for NSF or NASA funding and stipulating some dollar amounts? It's I could do that, and I will probably figure out a way to do that. It's just, again, part of Declassify UAP and everything I've put into it is trying to be reasonable about the topic and being kind of realistic and politically realistic about what might actually be on the table. Again, when I came up with those declassification targets, while one of them is recovery operations and reverse engineering programs and stuff like that, I didn't say, and by the way, we need to have every detail of how the technology is thought to work so everyone can build it in their garage. It's I wanted to be realistic about what the bounds of that might be. And in an environment where they're trying to literally pass a single executive order that scraps huge swaths of what the federal government does, asking for $100 million a year of science funding just isn't realistic.
Is it possible to lobby the NSF directly? I agree with you about the chaos, and they're probably going to get slashed heavily themselves in the next few years.
It is. I mean, listen, and I'm just an individual here with all the people that I'm, locking elbows with, including everyone who uses the website. Campaigns around the federal orgs directly and some of their key folks. And I don't even think we know who's going to be at the helm of some of these orgs at this point and how they're making decisions and what their priorities are. If that gets more clear over even just Q1 of this year of 2025, it might motivate particular strategies about how one might appeal to that agency directly. And, they do have some fluidity in how they assign grants, but again, we can't dodge around this. The current president tried to scrap, at least put a pause on, and for ideological review, let's just say it how it is, every federal grant out there yesterday. So conversations when the NSF has a lot of things on their plate, and NASA and they're trying to keep their current programs running, and they need to have people at the STSCI in order to keep James Webb working, and that costs money. this whole net new thing out of left field. It's a very tough political environment to try to initiate net new thinking when you're trying to just protect even the basics of what your mission has been oriented around.
So it kind of sounds like you're bearish on disclosure happening in this administration. Does that sound right to you? I've been thinking sort of either we get something in this first few months or we're not going to get anything, at least this year. Does that feel right to you? Like this will come out at the end of February.
It was a little bit of a litmus test for this that occurred just in the last day or so.
Okay.
And it had to do with drones. And, drones is one of these amorphous terms like UFO or UAP that has kind of come to mean nothing because it can kind of mean so many things.
That's a good point.
I mean, I can go to Target and buy a drone for $20.
Right.
And the CIA or other folks fly drones around that cost probably $250 million each. Are some of the most sophisticated pieces of technology humans have ever devised, can fly invisibly for days and days at a time, and then everything in between.
And they're all just drones.
And they're drones. So, and so, by the way, drones also might mean things that could possibly be truly anomalous UFOs and whatever. So it's become this catch-all term, right? Everything from I thought I saw an orb or to what could be just, again, there's industrial drones, there's defense drones, there's drones that have been legal for years now. I've got one in a storage cabinet right behind me that I haven't even touched in a few years that I got like almost a decade ago now. It's like drones are a thing and people are going to see them more and more and more, including some bigger ones doing stuff that we're not familiar with because it's a whole new class of technology. We didn't have like car things in the air other than airplanes. And now we've got these car-sized things going around doing stuff. They're used on farms. They're used in industrial facilities. They're used for monitoring. So, I have problems with just this drone category and how people kind of bring their own meaning to it. However, let's use it for a moment as a catch-all term, as many people have, including in the public, for something that just doesn't quite seem like it fits people's established patterns of what they see in the air. Maybe we don't know the ultimate nature and origin, synonymous with UFOs. Like we can't definitively say we know the nature and origin, but there's some kind of new anomalous aerial activity occurring that people seem also misreporting, also misidentifying typical things. Absolutely. And that's probably the majority of it, just like it always has been with UFOs too. Most sightings are not UFOs, even though people might read them as such. But let's just say, okay, drones are this anomalous thing. We've been hearing about these military base incursions for a few years. There was the Colorado and American West incidents over the last several years. More recently, over a year ago, the Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, stuff overseas, American bases in Britain and Germany. There's nuclear facilities around the world, including the US, but also Sweden and other places that have these drone situations. So, okay, drones are these things flying around and we just don't quite have our finger put on them. Well, the brand new, very young, very inexperienced White House press secretary, new one, came out yesterday and said, oh, by the way, drones, nothing to worry about. That's it. Oh, yeah, it turns out that they were just kind of some experimental stuff and fully regulated. No need to be worried. That's it. That's the official statement. And Trump did say, he said, within a day, it took a week, but within a day, you're going to know the truth about the drones. Oh, we're going to tell you. And that was what we got.
On camera, he asked his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, to look into this. And then a couple days later,
what we got was 30 seconds in a press conference of saying, oh, there's nothing there.
And she said explicitly, this is a message from the president. She just gave me this in the Oval Office.
That was what we were promised.
And these were FAA approved.
That statement is what they said they were going to give us. And that was the version of it we got. So for the vast majority of people who are not satisfied with that, either as it relates to the New Jersey incident specifically, which seems like she kind of used some language to kind of couch it in terms of New Jersey, but let's just say drones more broadly, because that's what people are really thinking when that word comes up around mysterious flyovers. They're thinking of Langley, they're thinking of England and Germany and drones around the world and drones seen over nuclear sites and all of it, right? That's the level that we're going to get from them. 30 seconds. Oh, no worries. Turns out it was just fine. Even if that's true, and this came up, George Knapp did a great little piece covering this in the last day. I saw it last night. He's like, so you're not going to tell us anything about what, experiments or whatever, testing that they were doing, who's doing it, how many of them, what are the locations? Are there other things that people might be seeing? Like there was none of that. There was just, don't worry about it. Drones are fine. Oh, there was all FAA authorized. No worries. Out of sight, out of mind. So if that's a litmus test or an indicator as to what those types of conversations and what level of information and truth were going to be provided, again, I'm not claiming to know that the New Jersey drones were this, that, or even maybe mostly misidentifications. I think, frankly, most of them probably were misidentifications.
Sure.
But that's not a mature conversation. That's not the conversation the public feels they're owed. That's not like a 30-minute sit down. We're going to do a presentation. We're going to talk about some of these drones that have been authorized, what you might be seeing when there's something that looks more like the size of the car, but it's like, just over the buildings. Like what could that be? What are the laws that actually kind of set out why you might be seeing these things more in the last year or two, or even in the last couple of months? Are there specific programs we can reference that began testing? Nothing. So I don't have very high expectations. If that was sort of how they're going to deal with something that might be more banal at the end of the day, what are we going to get for something that could be totally transformative of the world? Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to, I don't think it sets a great tone, and I don't think our expectations should be that high.
Let's talk a little bit about why this is so hard. Do you have an intuition about just like why for 80 years it has been difficult to just give us the gloss, give us the summary as you described?
Well, this is all my conjecture based on 40 years of being interested in the topic, but it's my conjecture, my own intelligence assessment, if you will. I think that in the context of World War II, and we may have been, there's talk about this Italian recovery from like 33 or something or whatever, and who knows. All I can say for sure is that in the midst of World War II, all around the world, both Allied and Axis powers really began noticing these things in the sky that largely conform to what we think of as UFOs today. They were the Foo Fighters, and everyone was seeing them. Everyone kind of wondered if it was everybody else, right? There's some people, it's all secret Nazi stuff. Well, the Nazis were seeing them too and thought they were ours.
And there are over 100 of these
This was happening in the Korean War. This was happening in every war since. We started really picking it up when radar became much more prominent as a technology available to us. And we started flying huge numbers of aircraft through the air in a way we had never done before leading up to World War II. So let's just say you have more domain knowledge now, both remote sensing and immediate presence. And so you started to bump into this thing, proverbially, mostly, and like a discovery was made. We don't necessarily know the ultimate nature and origin, but there's this other stuff up here. And people in the public also were kind of seeing things. And it also seems, and you can look at Valet and everything, like it might conform to folk knowledge, historical knowledge, indigenous knowledge, but we kind of now had a more contemporary science, technical way of sort of coming to that awareness. And we can call that like at least a nascent discovery, like the first guy who looked through a microscope and saw the little beasties, as they referred to them, the little germs. Something new was observed, and known to be there. Like it was a real thing. And World War II, like literally, like the forces of evil might win. Like the whole world is engaged around this struggle. You're developing nuclear weapons and then all of these other classes of capability that we never had before. And then you're like dropping nukes. And then like quickly, one of your main allies in Russia and the Soviet Union suddenly was like not so friendly with you. And then that became a whole struggle. And then the stealing of nuclear secrets, and like tense times to like make a major discovery when so many other paradigms are being shattered and reoriented to like, oh, and by the way, there's also these things flying around and we don't know what they are. And maybe they're space aliens and who knows? Like I can understand why the decision was probably initially made by certain stakeholders in government, why this was not news we just wanted to put on the broadcast. There was a lot of moving pieces on planet Earth at that point. There continue to be. And that's just like a whole new game that you need to suddenly introduce. And I don't think anyone was probably equipped to do that. And we're talking about a more conservative time in American and global culture and all of this. It's like the world was becoming a smaller place through technology and transit capability and everything. like it was not necessarily the time where like suddenly you need to like project that outward. Again, the Hubble deep field is now the scope of what you're dealing with, right? Like I get it, hard to fit that in. And so they decided probably, I think, to cover it up and study it. And, we'll figure out when and how is the right time. And the problem with cover-ups, especially when you are playing some games in order to maintain that, is that they're very hard to unwind. And they're really hard to unwind after like 1 year or 3 years or 5 years. But then it just kind of steamrolls and like you're decades and decades. I mean, you're almost a century into that pattern having developed. How the hell do you unwind that? Right? Like, how do you come to like, oh, by the way, there was this discovery that we made like 80 years ago, and it was like kind of a big deal, and we kind of didn't want to talk about it. In fact, we actually really besmirched the people for the large part. Oh, and yeah, the CIA in the early 50s really decided we were going to besmirch people who took this seriously. We're going to have disinformation. We're going to say these people are crazy. We have a few, maybe even potentially valid reasons for thinking that's the right approach. But we're going to do that. How do you unwind that? Again, it's why I think truth and reconciliation just absolutely needs to be the framework, because how do you find people liable for something like that? It's like there's no legal framework that can really handle having to evolve around this new data point that comes in of something that's potentially of a significant magnitude like that. So I think the impetus largely became, we need to keep the cover-up going because unwinding the cover-up itself is too difficult to even conceptualize. And it just became a self-reinforcing system. The playbook from like the early 50s was largely still working. You might have heard me before. I joke about like, somewhere at some agency, there's like a dusty 3-ring binder from the early 50s. And like, it's a handful of pages and it's kind of like talking about the UFO disinformation playbook that we're going to follow. And like in 1998, they added like 5 pages in the back of the binder for like how you adapt the playbook for the internet era, right? Like, oh, and now there's these forums and people are talking about UFOs, and we need to kind of run the playbook in those places. But by the way, it's largely just self-perpetuating at this point between cult-like figures that arise, disinformation, the mythology, people relating this to every last belief system that they have from every point of view. We barely need to do anything because just it's mostly all disinformation at this point. And I personally think, well, we probably all have a sense of some of the truth of the matter. I also think a lot of the mythology is probably not really an accurate view, but it feels like it must be the case because it's just become such an entrenched part of the mythos of the topic. And so it's like we can't not think of bug-eyed gray aliens when we think of UFOs, right? We can't think of ET. We can't not think of ET when we think of UFOs just because like UFOs as space things, which they may or may not be, or maybe some of them are and some of them aren't. I don't know for sure, but like these are paradigms that we have now kind of infused into the topic that themselves just kind of, until they get broken with something that's actually evidence and solid, they're going to maintain. So they barely have to do any work to keep the status quo going, I imagine. And now the thing that's changed is more of the insiders are coming out and saying, no, this is real. No, this is a thing. No, we actually have to do something about it. The public needs to learn more about it. We need to somehow figure out how to unwind these decades of secrecy around the topic. So I think the why, Caleb, is largely just human nature, how institutions tend to perpetuate patterns that they've pushed down the road year after year after year. And I mean, think about this if you're the president, right? And if you're the president or anyone in that position, but I think the president probably has a unique role in UAP transparency. And I do think a lot of the presidents probably have had at least a sense of what is the truth of the matter is. I don't know what that truth is necessarily, but I think a lot of them have at least been given a few bullet points. And I can understand why they never did the White House announcement, because that is the biggest political hot potato I could ever imagine. And politicians, if you've gotten to that stature, you are a very savvy political animal. I don't care what your ideology is, who's backing you, what your career has been like. One way or the other, you are a very savvy political beast if you're sitting in the Oval Office and you've gotten there. And so that person is going to look at this, I think, and they're going to say, okay, I'm glad you told me about this. If something significantly changes, let me know.
Mhm.
Until then, I don't want you to ever mention this to me again. That's what I think the answer has probably been from a lot of these folks. And I think maybe the ones who would have pushed a little more maybe didn't get quite as many of the bullet points revealed or whatever. But like, I can see why many people wouldn't want to be the individual who had to change up how things have been working. You probably have folks like the CIA and think tanks who have done studies, and we know that this has occurred through Rand and others. Like, what happens if we tell the world about UFOs?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we don't know. I don't think anyone knows. Mm-hmm. And that's the scary part, because these are, these people, at least to some degree, understand the institutions of our world, the patterns. Again, they could be a Donald Trump and want to tear down the federal government. He still is a person who understands his role in power and the networks that are supporting him and working against him. Why potentially just throw a grenade into the middle of something that you have figured out so well and you have done so well by? You're sitting in the Oval Office and then suddenly be like, but I'm just going to see what happens by tossing a grenade into the mix. That's not a very easy political decision to make. So I understand why even some of the individuals, even knowing that this is probably not a great thing to do, in the absence of any way to game out realistically what the ramifications of making that change are, the notion of maintaining the conservative approach, not conservative ideologically, but just being kind of conservative and not wanting to rock the boat and change things up too much.
Yeah.
That's probably the overwhelming motivator versus like, and randomly I'm going to show up on TV and explain to the world that we might not be alone, but we don't really know anything about it and we can't really do much about it and we don't really know all that much. And maybe it interacts with us. And by the way, the public is seeing these things too. Oh yeah, those abduction things or people having encounters. Yeah, maybe that's related to this. Maybe it's not. We don't really know. Or maybe we do know and we don't really want to tell you because that might freak people out. And then it's like, you start to look at things like religions and folk tales and even like the indigenous perspectives on the nature of the world. Most of these things are based around humans interacting with various forms of non-human intelligence, including often cosmic beings associated with the sky and the heavens, aka all that space stuff you see above your head when you don't have light pollution in your city blocking it all out every night. Because that's what people were bathed in every single night for hundreds of thousands of years. That was the heavens. They might not have even known what it meant or what it was. It was that cosmic ocean.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's these beings associated with it, and you can read things from various belief systems. I'm into Hinduism, at least partially, among other systems. And you can find Hindu texts where they're like, the wise men, they're like doing the Jake Barber thing. They're coming together. They're kind of like praying to Shiva, like reveal yourself, teach us about the nature of reality. And then there's a bright flash from the sky, a shot of light that comes down to the earth. A super shiny silver metallic orb comes down that everyone can see. And then Shiva emerges and schools those wise men on the non-dual nature of reality. So that's just all in the mix. Whether or not that actually has anything to do with UFOs, and it might not, but if it even begs the question, suddenly you're talking about a decision and a disclosure that might force us to start to begin to recontextualize some of the most basic things that our society has hinged around for thousands of years.
Yeah. Which is extremely exciting.
Well, see, and that's where I think we just need to come around to. It's freaking 2025. I was literally having this in-depth conversation with an artificial intelligence last night about coffee, all in-depth, coffee geek crap about, pour overs and grind sizes and acidity versus astringency. And it's cracking jokes. And it actually hallucinated at one point and told me that bigger grind sizes would lead to a slower drawdown. And I told it at one point, I was like, you hallucinated there. And it was and this is a coffee term, it's like, I'm glad you're dialed in enough to realize that I made that mistake. And so like, this is where we're
Wow.
at.
Cool.
Like, I'm sorry, forget UFOs. None of us know where the planet Earth is going to be in 3 years.
Yeah.
None of us. Like
time.
AI alone, shifts in power structures, potentially global conflicts that appear to be formulating, other things like, unexpected pandemics. Like, we don't even know what the next 6 months or even 1 month is going to look like. So I think we have to zoom back out. We have to look at this again. We can't contextualize something like this around more recent developments because there's no precedent. We have to look at it like germs, like microorganisms, a whole new realm of reality that's everywhere. It's always been here. Just because we discovered it doesn't mean it wasn't there yesterday. We had more primitive notions of it, miasmas or demons or imbalances of our humors and bodily fluids. Like, we knew there was something going on. We didn't have a mature view of it. We didn't have a fact-based view of what was going on for the large part. And yet, we kind of adapted around this set of discoveries as a society. And I don't know of too many people, Caleb, who will tell you we should have covered up the discovery of microorganisms.
Yeah.
And we definitely should have covered up the fact that, like, we have something to do with them.
Yeah.
That would be crazy.
Yeah.
Like we can just say that when we discover more of the truthful nature of the real world that we already inhabit, because disclosure changes how we think about things, but it doesn't actually change like what's going on. It's already going on. And I'm sorry, people, oh, well, maybe they'll reveal themselves. To be blunt, I saw one once in 2020 floating outside my freaking window. Like, people see these things. I know I have friends and family members who have had some very outlier experiences over the course of my life. People are already coming into contact with this thing. And I don't know that we have any reason to believe that's just not the way we have that relationship with that tier of reality. Like, it's doing things in the way that it does things, which is a variety of ways, apparently. And yet strange and kind of hard to understand in many cases, even like synchronicities and the whole high strangeness aspect. I think there's probably actual reasons behind that stuff, but it's like the miasma. Like, there's something and it's associated and we can kind of make out its form, but we actually don't have the understanding of it down pat. Yet when we commit to operating in a state of truth about the nature of the reality that we already inhabit, we have only prospered in the past. I'm also, you see probably Shiva over my shoulder here, my statue. I've been fascinated and really in love in many ways with religion, spirituality, mysticism, esotericism. That's actually been kind of part of my interest in UAP. Like, UAP is sort of a piece of that for me. And, I don't think that stuff goes away just because we announced this, and maybe there are some associations with more primitive notions of thinking about these things and more kind of fact-based notions of these things. Frankly, I think it enriches it. I think it opens up a lot of new possibilities for how that set of factors that have been part of the human experience almost can kind of be enlivened and maybe in a very useful way for us at this juncture.
Yeah.
I think the fact that some of those kind of, paradigms are so common across belief systems. Cosmic beings, women in blue. I mean, you can find that in ancient Hinduism. You can find that in people, channeling orbs and all of this. What's his name? Chris
Bledsoe.
It's like people were having those experiences thousands of years ago, and across cultures, across countries, across times, across cultural milieu. And yet, like, people are having somewhat consistent experiences around these things. To me, that seems like a potential harbinger of unity and bringing us together, even if we have slightly different ways of internalizing this stuff. We're having a common set of experiences around it. It's open and available to all of us. It probably has been for a very long time. Some people have a more intimate relationship with it apparently than others. And, it's funny because like, I don't even know that like the world changes so much so quickly when this discovery is made. Like we're still going to have the same day-to-day concerns. I don't personally think there's some miraculous energy technology waiting for us that's been in the sub-basement at Lockheed. I mean, maybe there is. I have to be open to that. But like, I'm looking around these days and I'm like, what if this is the world that has derived everything it can by throwing a lot of stuff at this stuff, this technology or these debris or whatever it might be? Like, we've had a lot of crazy developments over the last 75 years. I'm not saying they're all directly derived from that. I'm not saying we found semiconductors on the Roswell crash and learned how to build, transistors out of silicon. Robert Powell very intelligently has articulated why that is just so unlikely.
Yeah.
Why even any reverse engineering of such an advanced technology would be very difficult for us to pull off.
Yeah.
But this is what I would encourage people to think about. If you even knew it was possible to fly something around that didn't have control surfaces and methods of thrust and whatever, like it's doing stuff with physics that we don't quite get, as they're still saying, right? And I kind of take some of that at face value when Lloyd Austin is like, we don't know how they're doing what they do. Like, I actually wonder if those might be very truthful statements that are coming out in that context. Mm-hmm. But it's like, it inspires you because suddenly you even know it's possible.
Yeah.
And okay, well, it looks pretty plain on its surface and we stick it under a microscope and we're not seeing much. So we know we need to go deeper. What do we need to do to be able to go deeper, to look deeper, to understand these things more molecularly, subatomically? Is there quantum engineering of physics occurring, which is something I don't think gets talked about enough. We talk about space-time engineering. There's a level of reality that gives rise to space-time. Could be that these things are engineering on a level even sub-space-time, and the effect in the realm of space-time is just made manifest by even deeper levels of engineering of reality, for all we know.
Yeah.
Total aside here. Did you ever read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
Oh, totally. Love it.
Do you remember I think it was called the Infinite Improbability Drive?
Absolutely. Banana platoon.
Think about that. We know that quantum physics is based around the probabilities of how subatomic particles will interact with one another. It's not steadfast. It's probabilistic. Like, what if these things have figured out how to engineer the probabilistic unfolding of reality in the quantum realm? Like, so you need to go deep.
Yeah.
Suddenly you need to have things like giant particle colliders to break apart the smallest things that we know of so we can go smaller, because we know that we need to go smaller to figure out how these things are working. Down. So I'm like, what if our whole world is the world that was impacted technologically even by the discovery of these things? And it was more like the discovery itself and knowing it was possible gave rise to more investment, as we were talking about earlier, investment in certain branches of science funding. Mm-hmm. Someone in a back room knows, okay, some of the egghead scientists want to build this particle collider because they're eggheads and they like to think about that stuff. I'm actually going to fund it because I know that this other thing is going on and we need to go deeper in order to figure it out. And so, okay, we will spend $10 billion on an international part. Again, I'm not saying that's necessarily how it's worked, but it seems like a reasonable hypothesis. And that's why if there is more to be derived out of these technologies, it might just have to do with us as a species investing more in basic scientific capabilities to plumb deeper and deeper and deeper into the nature of reality, so we can even slightly figure out how do these things do the things that they're clearly doing that we do not understand based on our current understandings of physics, which is exactly, in a manner of speaking, what John Kozlowski, the new director of Aero, acknowledged. He says, this dude is a quantum optics engineer. Dude's probably was at NSA, was helping design quantum computers or some stuff, right? Real sharp dude. Probably not a total coincidence. Someone with an understanding of that kind of stuff is on this now. And he was part of the UAP task force, I believe. So it's not a topic that's necessarily totally net new to him.
We don't know
and
that.
Here he is saying, me and the scientists that I know, quantum physics engineers and stuff, we can't really figure out how these things are doing. So just that quest to figure it out could absolutely change the world. Maybe it has changed the world, and maybe it could change the world further with more effort if we opened it up, gave it some more funding, invited more people into the realm of exploring this. And I think, and this is my hypothesis, if you really zoom out and you look at the whole situation that way, and I hope someone of influence is listening to this podcast right now and maybe internalizing this. If you look at the overarching trajectory of humanity and how major discoveries have impacted us as a people, as a species, our world, there's some negative consequences of some of that. However, I like the fact that there's like antibiotics and I haven't already died 100 times.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had to take antibiotics, and if I didn't have access to them, I would have croaked. And that's like a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, think about just how many people used to die in childbirth, and sadly still do, both in the United States and in other countries. But like, that's because of a lack of access and not really a lack of capability, right? What we have been able to engineer in our world has made things much more comfortable for people. Like, I would much rather, as crazy as the world is, like, I am more comfortable as a human being sitting in my house in Baltimore with soap and antibiotics and access to decent food and all this, even just as a middle-class guy, than 100 years ago. Or think about 200 years ago, what your life is like on a day-to-day basis. Oh, I got a cut, it got infected, and we have to chop my arm off now. Like, if we zoom out and look at disclosure as something that, is that level of a shift in our thinking and our capabilities, our knowledge and understanding of how the world works, the level of win that could come from that, even just acknowledging it and then starting to orient around that knowledge in a broader way, there are so many possibilities that begin to unfold that speak, I think, to a very bright future for humanity. And that's just because we've been motivated to figure it out more. That doesn't even necessarily mean there was a magic thing we could turn the key and suddenly we all have free power. The benefit comes from the quest. And, Valet and others have talked about this, and I was very affected by him. I disagree on certain points, but like, I agree with him on much of his outlook. And it's like, these things seem to be both inviting us to shift our perspectives, motivating us. He talks about feedback loops and control systems. Microorganisms, man, the microbiome, that's what's happening. It's a feedback loop-based set of control systems. But it's one that we have agency over. And I think this is the key. And this might sound totally far out, but, we kind of know that we often don't have agency over microbiome and microorganisms and whatever, but we actually kind of know that we do have a lot of agency over it. It's invisible. It's ubiquitous. There's all sorts of the little creepy crawlies. They're in us. Again, they're in the air. Some are good. Some are bad. Some we're not quite so sure about. Some you just need to maintain in the right balances. But like basic decisions we make in our lives, I'm not going to eat all that junk food. I'm going to eat some better stuff, directly affects the little guys that you've got living on you, how they help your overall physical well-being, even your mental well-being, they're finding out. So if we have agency over that invisible realm, if we make certain choices and influence those feedback loops by putting a new input into the system and getting new outputs out as a derivation of that, I think we should be open to the possibility that's also true when you scale out from us macroorganisms to the realm of the so-called meta-organism, as I call them, right? Like, we may have more agency over it than we realize. We may be in some position of driving what our relationship with that realm looks like, how it manifests for us. Some people have very negative experiences around these things. Some people have life-changingly positive experiences. I have found that some, maybe not universally, this should be studied. This is what a post-disclosure reality might start to look at. Do people who have deep traumas, this is just a hypothesis, a question to be studied. I don't have an answer. But like, does one's, holding onto of certain lived traumas affect the nature of their interaction with these more anomalous things? Is their own mental, psychological, call it spiritual state in any way reflected back from their encounters with this other stuff? Again, is there a feedback loop, a control mechanism? But I can put inputs into that control system, and my state of mind is an aspect of that. You know, this is something that I've already heard commented on about the Jake Barber and the Skywatcher stuff. You know, they're like, oh, we did this, we established these mental links. You know, some of these people have this capability more, and we can kind of sometimes control these things, or at least beckon them, and da-da-da-da-da. I was telling you about that ancient Indian text from like 1,000 years ago, where they're like summoning the orb that Shiva emerges from, right? In those contexts, it was known in esoteric realms, mystics have known from their own set of frameworks, again, speaking about mysticism here, that anomalous, non-human entities, intelligences, cosmic beings, demons, angels, whatever you want to call them, those are all just labels for essentially non-human intelligence, but that's something that we interact with. It's been known that your state of mind, if you are either not choosing to interact with it, but it interacts with you, or you put out the call like those sages did and summon the orb and speak to Shiva about non-dualism and the nature of reality at the deepest level, what you put into that call, surprise, surprise, sometimes affects what you get back. So, you know, in our bodies, it's these very concrete things. We ingest this sweetener, this mineral, this vitamin, this nutrient, and it affects, you know, the microorganisms. And we can make choices about that and affect them and create a new cycle. Like, for all we know, it's the mental and psychic and spiritual realm and the energies and you know, nutrients we inject into that aspect of our being that affects the relationship we have with this other sphere of reality, the meta. So these are just ideas, but you can't even really experiment around these ideas unless you have more openness around the topic. But the win that I smell in the air, you know, the set of wins that we can derive from a more fact-based and nuanced set of understandings around that, it's immense. So I think there's just probably really mostly stuff to be gained, but you're not going to get to that and decide to make the change as a policymaker, I think, just by looking at all the minutia. You have to be the kind of thinker who can really zoom out, really see that connection, draw parallels between things like our relationship with another invisible realm, and say the human story is oriented around discovery and, you know, to a degree, mastery of our domain. This is a part of our domain we have not fully figured out or mastered yet. We don't know how they do the things they're doing. Every other time we figured something like that out, there's been a lot of gains to be made. We just need to kind of have some faith that this is another one of those types of things and be willing to do it.
Faith is such an interesting word there, because you just caught me thinking about this confluence of spiritual and technological investigation. I think I can go to both of these questions. One, to your point of a point regarding stakeholder interest. We've had these eroding spiritual institutions in the last couple hundred years, especially in the West, as they're dealing with the modern science and sort of a crumbling of the faith-based spiritualism that we used to have. But if we find out suddenly that there's like an actual spiritual reality that we didn't understand how to interact with, but that like some of that ancient wisdom is real, that might infuse a ton of energy into religious practice in a way that will feel weird, because it'll be like a listicle about spiritual hygiene now, but that might get people into religious worship or like spiritualism and mysticism in a way that's not just like fake airy-fairy new age BS, but like genuine exploration of the nature of reality from a personal perspective. And then that's just one facet of this glittering gem that also includes like quantum engineering on the other side of it. So both of those like stakeholder organizations like science and religion have a reason to drive toward more investigation here. Another phrase that came up for me here was this idea. I've been thinking about curiosity a lot, and this phrase that bubbled up for me here was, I would like to see a consensus of curiosity around this subject. And I actually think that might be a better way to think about it than disclosure. I think disclosure does mean a specific thing, and I do want it.
But you're right. It still is sort of a phrase even that's oriented around like disclosing something that was wrongly kept from us.
Yeah, and it has specific meanings with regard to like the military and intelligence, and to some extent like elected government organs of our civilization. But when it comes to like scientific inquiry or spiritual exploration, curiosity is the order of the day. So if I'm thinking about maybe like 4 or 5 avenues that we have to get people curious, to like open this throttle and engage more minds on the subject, to move toward this discovery, as you've so eloquently laid out, that can improve so much of our world. One is we get people who know stuff already to tell us. That's a project of disclosure, and you're working on it. You're doing some of the best work in the world on it. 2 is we fund science publicly, which, as you've pointed out, is going to be really hard. 3 is we fund science privately, which is also pretty difficult, but maybe looks slightly more feasible. And then 4 is we get information from whatever these beings are, if they are in fact beings, which it sure seems like they are, to light us up. Oh, there's one more, which is that we do this slow grind of raising public awareness by having these conversations, talking to our friends, getting people more interested. These scientific orgs that we love, like SCU that you're a part of and Galileo that you were, are spreading that interest. And over the years, you would hope that it'll turn into hundreds more people who are doing serious research. But even they are doing volunteer research right now. And they're still, I've talked to Galileo scientists who are like, not now, bro, I can't talk about this, because they still feel weird about it. And it would be so great if we could break through that. So to the last open avenue of inquiry there, do you think it would make sense to have some kind of, Skywatcher-like project or Shiva mysticism-like project of public contact and communication? Like, do you think we maybe should consider lobbying the NHI?
So, wow, that was all very well stated. Very good consolidation of a lot of the many streams we've been talking about.
Thank you.
So thank you for phrasing it all that way. I'm going to really zoom out. I told you I've been kind of a student in being fascinated by mysticism and spirituality and religion and all this for my whole life. I'm going to give you a little bit of a personal answer on some level. Just when I say that, I mean kind of from my own perspective, through my own lived set of experiences and thoughts and emotions and feelings and all of that. So when I was in elementary school in the 80s, around the time I was getting really fascinated with UFOs and seeing movies like Flight of the Navigator and being like, okay, I am the navigator. Shit, what do I do? Because that was, of course, my takeaway from that movie. How can I be the navigator as effectively as possible for all that may be coming, and be part of navigating this, because many people are helping us with this. And maybe there are some forces from beyond helping out. I don't know. I was also having some other very strange thoughts enter into my head. I grew up in a fairly rural town in Western Massachusetts, near a college town, Amherst, Northampton area, but I was a little on the periphery in a little hill town. Went to school in a town of 2,000 residents. The school class I was in through 2nd through 6th grade was about 14, 15 kids. So very intimate experience, a very good elementary school, beautiful environment. Just it was pretty idyllic in some ways. And so I would play kickball and soccer and the other things, handball with the red rubber balls, against the brick wall of the school building with other kids and do that stuff. But sometimes I would take walks, even just during recess. I also just did a lot of hiking and walking, even just as a kid. We had woods on our property and we could walk all over the town. I mean, sometimes we were just walking all day with our friends, but also sometimes just by myself. It was on a really nice wooded street. I could walk up and down and just spend an hour just kind of zoning out. And in addition to a lot of thinking about UFOs and more like, Jesus, why the hell isn't this something more people are open to? I just didn't get it. I was like, this just should be out in the open. For some reason, I just knew it to be a thing, even at that point, even though I didn't personally, at least knowingly, have experiences at that point. turns out maybe some people in my immediate vicinity were having experiences, and I was also having some types of experiences. I didn't associate them with UFOs, but I was having some outlier experiences of my own, even in elementary school. Just one example is like lucid dreams, and having that really like motivate my thinking about what the nature of reality is. I'm like, I can knock on things in my dreams. I know I'm dreaming. But what am I? Who are these other beings in my dream? What's this environment that's being generated? I can hear things, touch things. Like, what the fuck? Like, it was pretty weird. It was very stimulating. Not a totally unique experience, but it really motivated a lot of, you could call it philosophizing in me. Other things that were coming into my head, I'll just, emerging notions, taking these walks, looking around, looking at like, the soccer field and maybe some people playing in the trees, surrounding the school, and looking up and looking around and saying, and again, this is like elementary school. I've never been very good at math. I'm not a scientist, et cetera, et cetera. Looking around and saying, this is all one unfolding equation. Now, I didn't know what an algorithm was at that point. I was interested in technology and computers. Never have been really a coder type or even a systems admin, but I'm technologically savvy and think in those terms pretty easily. I don't know why that popped into my head. This is all one unfolding equation. Now, decades later, I learned that not only is this some of like the core tenets of mysticism in a sense, but it's also what a lot of folks at the very kind of outer reaches of physics, philosophy, metaphysics, computational theory, information theory are kind of starting to think. Like, this is maybe all one unfolding equation. I read a great book by a theoretical physicist, Heinrich Pace, recently. It's called The One. And he's a theoretical physicist. And he talks about how monism or non-dualism, the belief that there is really only one thing fundamentally and everything is sort of a facet of it, if you will, but it's really one cohesive system. That spiritual notion, which is really embedded universally in most of the world's traditions. Most of the world's traditions are at their core non-dualistic or monistic in nature. And relating very deeply the notions of subject and object to that. Like, I have a subjective experience, the first person. There is also the second person, which is sort of the externalized first person from another point of view. There's third person reality. Consciousness seems to be kind of synonymous with this meeting of the first person and the second person to create an ostensible third person reality. Like, consciousness is clearly part of this whole thing. Well, most of the non-dualistic traditions at their core make awareness the heart of their vision of divinity. If you think of Moses going onto the mountain to talk to the glowing thing coming from some brush that wasn't fire, but that was described as the burning bush, but it even says it wasn't a burning bush. He gets like the rules to run society by and keep people happy. And then he goes, it's like, who are you? Who should I tell my people down the mountain I've been talking to and I got this from? And it says, I am. I am that I am. Tell them I am sent you. That is, I think, the most profound thing in the Old Testament. It's also the core of Eastern non-dual philosophy, that this notion of one's I-ness, their subjective aspect, their amness, their being, is unified. That's what I am really is taken to mean by many philosophers, especially in Eastern traditions. It seems to have been largely missed in the Western traditions, even though that's what this being seemed to have told Moses the nature of divinity is that it's I amness. We missed that sadly in the West, that message. But that message has been coming from cosmic beings across traditions for millennia, that the subjective and objective natures of reality are unified and one, and your sense of I amness, which is really what meditation, we were talking before we started recording about meditation. Meditation is largely not to sail through astral realities or make contact with other beings. It's to make contact with the self, the uppercase S self, not your ego identity, not your name, not your labels that you use, not your body, not your thoughts, your feelings, your experiences. You have all of these things. You have a brain. If you have a brain, who are you? If you have thoughts and emotions, who are you who's having thoughts and emotions? If you have a body, we say, I have a body. But who's the you who has the body? It is awareness. And awareness exists and is real. It's actually the sum total of our lived experience is only the realm of awareness. My eyeballs are not seeing this computer screen and seeing you on the screen, and I'm not hearing you through my speakers right now. I have these sensors that are creating electrochemical signals that are being interpreted by this crazy neural network that is projecting a version of reality as my sensors are capable of detecting it on what? Who's detecting all of that? Who are you, as the Indian saint Ramana Maharshi made the focus of his self-inquiry teachings? Who are you? That's the core of really what most traditions of meditation are there to reveal. That is the self-awareness. That is the revelation. And as Ramana himself said, that line of the Old Testament where the divine nature is identified as I am and I amness is the ultimate teaching of enlightenment, ostensibly. So anyway, as a non-dualist and having thoughts like this is all one unfolding equation, which is a very non-dualistic thing to be thinking as a 8 or 10-year-old, I also was thinking about UFOs, as I said. And I was also really curious why we weren't ever talking in school or most other places about something I had kind of thought about, which was, I'm not this body. I'm not this brain. I'm not this guy, Nick. I mean, I get that that's like a facet of how I kind of am carrying myself, but like, why are we not talking about the operator that's clearly kind of looking out through all of these things and interacting with this realm? Because when I closed my eyes and, I didn't even know I was doing it, but when I was meditating as a kid, even if it was in that liminal state between wake and sleep or whatever, and I spent, a lot of time in that in-between state, the gap as it's sometimes called, you're there and you're hovering and you're just consciousness. And it's like, I'm there, but I'm clearly not who's thinking this right now?
Yeah.
It's not my body. It's not my brain. It's not like there is some pattern of awareness that is a thing. So I was like, why are we talking about that?
Just to hop in, I've heard people use the word noticing here a lot, and I really liked it. Like if you get into a meditative state and notice the sensations of your body, you can then flip that noticing and try to notice what is noticing things.
That's
right?
Exactly right. You inverse it. You notice the noticer and realize I'm the noticer. So, or
there's something about that feeling that it can be almost physical. It's like spiritually physical, that sensation.
Because it's real. That's the isness of it. This phrase came to me on a walk once, a few years ago. Being is a being, as in the state. And it's funny we use the same words for these things. Being can mean like the state of something existing materially and objectively. We use the exact same word to refer to the one that is experiencing that state of beingness.
Yeah. So you're saying it's a noun and a verb, a being.
And it's one thing.
Is being.
Beingness is a being. There is a subjective, perceptual, that is the first person point of view to this state of existence.
Yeah.
So I'm like, why aren't we talking about this stuff in school?
Yeah.
I'm like, this seems like a big thing to not ever touch on. And it's why maybe I started getting interested and decided to have a bar mitzvah and pursue that and mystic information and started reading about, things like the Monroe Institute, as a teenager. And I was like, these people seem to be talking about this stuff more, but it's not being covered in school. Like none of the adults are talking about it. I have to get into these more spiritual things. And I grew up in a kind of spiritually minded family with my mom and everything and, open to that stuff. not one particular way of looking at it, a real openness to just kind of exploring it, which I thank her for profusely on a regular basis. And,
Nice.
that kind of, again, so I was kind of thinking this very non-dualistic way before decades. I only really kind of learned more formally about non-dualism in like 2013, probably. And then I was like, oh, I thought I invented all this. Wait, everything is sort of making sense now. Oh my God. So, and thank you, Ramana, because I think I was reading his classic, pamphlet, essentially, Who Am I? And I was like, wait a minute. I think I know what he's getting at. Holy cow. So, when we talk about spirituality, this is kind of take it home here. We're talking about science. We're talking about physics and observing our material reality. We're also talking about these highly subjective experiences around this topic. And we're talking about topics like religion and spirituality and mysticism and esoteric knowledge that have maybe hinted at some of this stuff. Or at least have had kind of analogs. At the very least, we can think of, cosmic beings in these traditions as, from the sky being an analog to what we're seeing with the current stuff. Maybe they are not the same thing. But we've had those kind of paradigms in our awareness for thousands and thousands of years. They might be some of our oldest notions of reality for all I know. They're clearly some of our most important stories because we've built whole civilizations around that framework. Religious systems, God, kings, and rulers who take on that divine, character in their role, and now are also running society, whether or not they were or not. Anyway, these are some very old ways of looking at things. They've been with us for a while. So as we try to figure out this UAP thing, I really think we ought to look at it non-dualistically. And if you read what a lot of the cosmic beings seem to say in these traditions, they seem to be intoning non-dualism many a time, not exclusively, but many a time, as like the thing that we need to be paying attention to. That unification of I-ness and amness that is awareness. And it's like that they came up with these notions long time before we had ideas about things like a unified field that probably exists, and essentially all things we think of in this realm of the relative and informational exist within, are kind of birthed within this field. We have quantum field theory. We think there might be a unified field that all those different quantum fields are really just kind of, again, their own facets of. We have to, I think, be open to the idea that subjectivity is just as much a part of that foundational thing as its objective nature, and we need to unify those things. That's actually been the core message, as best as I can tell, in most of these religious and spiritual belief systems. That seems to imply that there is no difference between the mundane and the mystical. There is no difference between the scientific and the spiritual. It's either all spiritual or none of it is, because it's supposed to describe the ultimate nature of reality, and physics and molecules and subatomic quantum fields and all this stuff is real. But that isn't necessarily mutually exclusive from the more subjective experience of all of these things, and knowing that there's this very intimate relationship between the subjective and these objective things that we can study. And so I think the UFOs, and maybe this has been going on a long time, maybe not, have been motivating us to think about things in a non-dual fashion, and not just like things we think of as spiritual. Like non-dualism can be like a really useful point of view to have when you're having an argument with someone, or when you're trying to look at something like UFO cover-ups, and you're saying, do I want to think of these guys as the enemy and have to kind of inherently set myself up in a kind of dualistic, at odds notion of my relationship with them? Or is there a way of sort of uniting all of these points of view into sort of like the thing that simply is, and figuring out how to massage that system and everything that's included in it, which is everything, in the direction I'd like to see it evolve towards? So non-dualism is a very like tactical kind of tool. It doesn't just, you can use it as a motivating point of view in like all of the day-to-day goings on of your life. And frankly, it's kind of motivated the perspective of Declassify UAP. So to bring it all home, I don't know that greater discoveries about this topic, and if that brings us to even greater understanding of the ultimate nature of reality, and things that we have put in the category of spiritual, like it's also kind of what quantum physics has told us. Like quantum physics has this thing called like, it's this active measurement or observation, and they can't quite figure out what it is, but it seems to be kind of intimately oriented around kind of collapsing things into what we perceive as reality.
Like the way a photon or wave will behave if you're paying attention to it or not.
The active measurement itself is noticing, is choosing what to take measure of. That's as baked into quantum physics as it's baked into religion, and saying I am is the nature of reality. And by the way, it's not just wooey new age people who make that link between what quantum physics has told us about the nature of reality and these kind of mystical inklings that are largely non-dualistic in nature. Schrodinger saw that. I think Bohm saw that. Many like key quantum physicists themselves saw the link in these things. So, Carl Nell said something really interesting. I can't remember if it was at the SALT conference or a Soul conference that he spoke at. He said there's something like pretty like profound. I can't remember the exact words he used. Almost like not when you learn that the belief system that like has been a matter of faith and has been largely predicated on faith becomes something you learn is real and actually exists. It might be recontextualized to a degree, but like some of those tenets are there and real. And like it's a pretty profound awakening, if you want to use that word, or at least part of an implication of that word. And so I think if we're willing to take this issue on non-dualistically, look towards solutions that are framed in that way, and then willing to say, this might change our understanding of physics, and this might change our understanding of religion and philosophy and metaphysics and esotericism and all of it. And it's not two things that are being changed. It's one thing. It's what is. It's what actually is. There is only what actually is. And so that thing, whatever it is, the state of play, might equally be expressible in spiritual terms or whatever, and might equally be expressible in scientific, concrete, mundane terms. And they are the same thing. And I think that vision can actually really help get us through the intricacies of disclosure or this transformation and this openness to curiosity, which I think is a really brilliant way that you put it. And I'm going to totally borrow if that's okay.
Absolutely, please. That was brilliant and beautiful, and this is the biggest possible picture, so it's right, I think, to go out here. But would you like to close with a call to action? Would you like to point people toward your work or invite them to engage?
Yeah, for anyone who's made it to like this point of Nick and Caleb talking shop and going way out into the outer limits, if you will.
It's fun for us.
I enjoy it. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I don't know if I've even gone quite this deep in my thinking about some of this stuff. So thank you so much for creating the opportunity for me to put it out there in this way and be a great, partner in that conversation.
Thank you.
I invite people to, of course, first of all, go to, if you're a U.S. voter, because it is really aimed at U.S. voters, because that's what the system that's built into the website does, Declassify UAP.org. All one word, .org, but I got every domain name and every variation because no one had apparently thought to put those terms together before. And so I got every social media site login, with the dash, without the dash, with the underscore. I was like, we just need the save the whales term for this movement.
Yeah.
What do we want to do? Declassify UAP? Okay, there's the name. So go to declassifyuap.org or any kind of variation of that. You get to the website. I encourage people to watch the video. I worked with a firm that I worked with in the media realm. Weirdly, their office is like literally next to the Pentagon. So it was fun putting that together. I wrote it and helped produce it. And then they did the craft work. And, we brought in a voiceover actress and it was so much fun. But the video I'm very proud of, and I'd like people to share it with friends, with family members, because it really motivates people. Again, it's like, I wanted it to look like a little bit of a political ad. I went to a firm that does top level political ads and campaign ads and issue ads. So take a look at the video, go to the action center, fill out the fields, hit contact. And even in this climate of unknowing and knowing whether the political system is ready for this change, part of us getting the change is manifesting it and being part of that. And we need to give things voice in order to do that. So please be part of the thousands of Americans who are doing that. And then periodically, and I usually put out an email, and you can sign up for the email list. I really only put out a few a year, but I do it at the time, and I call them action alerts. Because like there's something legislatively happening and we just want to make the phones light up in certain offices. So get into a pattern of kind of keeping your eyes on the topic, see when new bills are introduced, and see when people are making calls and sending more messages. But just go to declassifyuap.org, go to the Action Center and send the message now, and be part of that group. Go to the declassification targets section. Doesn't mean you have to completely agree with them. I'd love to learn what other people kind of think about this stuff, but familiarize yourself with kind of how I laid out what I think a reasonable set of goals are to actually get more information on as members of the public. Doesn't mean we have to know every last gory detail. Doesn't mean we need vindication if we felt this stuff should have been out years ago. We need to move forward. We need to kind of bring everyone together as best as possible. And so, think about how you can ask and make calls and talk to people about wanting to get some of these action items in place, pieces of media that show these things clearly. They're getting that pressure because Kozlowski is talking about trying to figure out ways to get us some of the more juicy stuff that show true anomalies more clearly. So they're hearing the pressure to get those types of materials. So please familiarize yourself with that. I've kind of moved off of X mostly at this point, very active at this point on Blue Sky. So if people are on Blue Sky or want to explore a new social media site that isn't chock full of really weird, awful stuff, because I never wanted every social media site to look like 4chan. I don't know about you, but I never asked for that, and that's what it's become. So if you want something else, I really recommend Blue Sky. And I'm very active there, and I interact with people, and you can talk with me, and also kind of get my views, and we can share views about groups coming forward like Skywatcher and these whistleblowers, or some new talking head or a new documentary that comes out. I tend to be very available and love chatting with people daily about this stuff. And just get involved, keep your eye on it, be willing to talk to friends and family a little bit. Some of them who are a little more interested, tell them about Declassify UAP. Hover over them. Say this. We can go on your smartphone right now, and this is going to take 30 seconds. And this is just you sending a message to your House rep and your 2 senators and the president and the vice president saying, we need more openness around this, guys. And they need to hear that in a growing set of numbers. So that's all I really ask people to do, and stay on it and stay open-minded. Try to orient around a non-dualistic way of approaching this topic. Don't feel you have to make the scientific inquiry and the spiritual inquiry 2 separate things. There really is only what there is. And whatever UAP are, or whoever they are, if there's a who involved, they are both physical, and they may deeply resonate with some of these things that we've put in this other category of the metaphysical. And they are just what they are, just like we are just what we are. And we should take things as they really are and be willing to accommodate them in our worldviews.
This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time, Nick.
Yeah, we went a little long here. People are going to need to listen in 3 parts, but I think that's cool.
We did. Thank you, listeners, for being generous with your time as well. And thank you again to Nick for your work and your wisdom and sharing your time with us. It was really great to meet you, man. Keep going.
I had a blast, Caleb. This is one of the funnest chats I've ever had about this topic. So thank you for being the other guy involved.
Same here, man. That was great. And that's the show. Thank you for watching or listening. Please support us on patreon.com/WTUFO, patreon.com/WTUFO. That will increase the odds that the show continues to exist. If you're listening in a podcast format, you can also rate and review us on your podcast player of choice. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can like and subscribe. It also never hurts to tell a friend about us or pop us in a social feed. Maybe if you have a favorite episode, you could share it on a thread somewhere. Thank you again for watching, listening, enjoying, and supporting, and I hope you're all having a great day.